to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin here as we enter the third week of the Purim War. Many are calling it the Ramadan War. We here are also calling it a major escalation in the Third World War. But regardless, the U.S., Israeli, Jewish escalatory aggression war against the Iranian people, the land of the Aryans, the Persians, is entering its third week, and we, of course, have been covering it better, closer than almost anybody else on the internet. Hours and hours of content analysis. Of course, those of you that have been tuning in, monitoring the situation with us, thank you so much for your support. Thank you so much for being here with us. It's been quite a ride, but as prophecies are fulfilled, as bombs fall, as unfortunately lives are lost in this theater of conflict, many are calling it even the Third Gulf War, which makes sense as well. We are, of course, monitoring how it is spreading to other countries, the major escalations that are coming. Israel's preparing for a major ground invasion of Lebanon to occupy the entire region south of the Litani River. America is sending 5,000 plus U.S. amphibious assault marine forces to potentially invade Karg and other islands in the Persian Gulf occupied by Iran. We are, of course, preparing for the Houthi strikes. They have said they're entering the war on the side of Iran, and they will be announcing 0 hour imminently. So by the time you are listening to this episode, the Houthis may have already entered the war as the USS Gerald R Ford loiters in the Red Sea to intercept them. There are rumors that the USS Abraham Lincoln, our major aircraft carrier that hosts the F-35s and allows them to launch and strike the Iranians, has been struck, has been removed from the theater of conflict. Of course, the Iranians are claiming this. America has neither confirmed nor denied these rumors. Of course, the USS George HW Bush is also entering the region soon. So we're going to be discussing all of this and so much more. Of course, as the new Ayatollah has been elected, he has released new statements, but the Iranians are standing strong. Trump has clearly stumbled into a war that he does not understand. So we are going to be discussing all of this and so much more. The downing of the 2 KTC Stratotankers, other major losses that not only the Americans, but now the French and the Italians are sustaining. So very much a regional war that is affecting more and more powers. So it's good to be here discussing the Purim War with everybody. Again, thank you all so much for tuning in. And as we dive into this week of World War III analysis, Dmitry, how are you doing?
Yeah, doing great, Conrad. It really has been an eventful week. It's been very difficult to keep up with all of the major stories, with all of the misinformation, the fake news being thrown about, and definitely looking out for those new fronts opening up in the Middle East, the Third World War, as things continue really to escalate all over the map, not just in the Middle East, literally tensions in the Orient and Asia, and the ongoing bloodshed still raging on in Eastern Europe between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and among the, generally just speaking, the Slavic people. And there are intense energy tensions going on around the world. So the economy really is breaking apart at the seams. It's been an intense 14 days, I can say. And as we enter into the third week and Ramadan sort of comes to a close, it'll be interesting to see how most of these Islamic countries respond to the US and Israeli aggression, if they're going to begin changing their tunes. So very much monitoring the situation here on World War Now.
No, I don't think anybody is monitoring the situation quite as much as we are. Of course, we all daydream about having the ideal monitoring the situation center. I see that 24/7, the People's Liberation Army in China, their command center is monitoring the war, and I'm very jealous of the setup that they have. So get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co, become a paying supporter, a subscriber on our Substack to support the analysis here. Maybe someday we can get enough funds to have our own World War Now command and control center to really autistically monitor the situation as situations like this demand, of course. So get behind the paywall. Check out this week's recent Ether Hour episode. Of course, for those that don't know, Ether Hour is our weekly show for paid subscribers, for paid supporters. Of course, everyone gets a free preview, but the full episode is available for those that decide to support us $7 a month or a little bit less, I believe $75 a year on the Substack. Of course, you get access not only to all the Ether Hour episodes, including our recent this week's discussion with Gregory Hears, all about Julian the Apostate, the first neo-pagan, the first Zionist, 4th century Roman emperor, really fascinating figure who attempted to revert the empire back from Christianity as Constantine had done and converted into paganism. So be sure to check that out. So many parallels today. Of course, he was a Zionist, pro-Jewish Philo-Semite emperor who waged war on the Persians. Again, not very different from our own Donald J. Trump. So very, very relevant historical analysis episode. You can check that out down in the link below, but you get access to hundreds of other episodes with Abbot Trifon, episodes with Father Peter Hears, episodes with Father John Whiteford, episodes with Cameron McGregor, a lot of really great episodes with him, episodes with Syrian Girl, huge analyses about Palestine, Syria, the Middle East that has been going for years and years and years. Ether Hour, we have so many historical and Orthodox relevant subjects. So get behind the paywall and support us there. You also get access to premium channels and chats on our Discord server and access to the Q&A threads that we should be releasing more of soon where you get to ask us any and all questions to be answered in future Ether Hour episodes. So thank you again all so much for tuning in, and all of that again linked below at worldwarnow.co. But diving into the analysis for this week, continued escalations in the Persian Gulf as the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, despite the rumors of the Iranian Navy being completely destroyed. Unmanned nautical vehicles, as well as just other ships that they still currently have, are destroying U.S. tankers, Danish tankers, Greek tankers. A few Chinese tankers have come under fire, but generally Chinese tankers have been allowed to travel through the straits, and the Iranians have even claimed that we will allow other Gulf and European countries' tankers to go forward if they break diplomatic relations with Israel and the U.S. and kick them out of their countries. So the Iranians, again, standing strong, rejecting all calls for negotiations, saying that they're ready for a years and years and years long war. It's clear that at the very least, Trump and the Israelis might be preparing for maybe their 4 to 5 week timeline, but undoubtedly, I think the rumors of them being regrettably forced to continue this on until September at least is probably more close to reality at this point. But I guess, Dmitry, we should probably just address both the rumors and the confirmed losses right now in the region. Of course, gas is going up and up and up as we speak. We'll probably discuss the economic situation in a second. But as of right now, we probably need to discuss the KC Stratotankers that were taken out. We've got confirmed the 6 crew members were taken out on one of the ships. That is, you can see the plane crashing down after being shot down by Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces air defenses, and crashing there. 6 crew confirmed dead. The other Stratotanker, I believe, was able to land in safe airspace, and everybody survived. So with that, on top of the damage done to the USS Abraham Lincoln, we don't know about any casualties, but at this point, based on the lack of pictures and confirmation from the U.S. to deny the now widely spread rumors, I think we can safely say that something did happen to the Abraham Lincoln. So what is your analysis of these two events, and how do you think the U.S. is going to respond? Of course, U.S. and Israel have, in the past even 24 hours, done some of their largest strikes against Iran, but Iran has struck the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. They have continued to pound Dubai for the past few days, as well as Erbil and Kuwait. And of course, the strikes on Israel continue to escalate as Hezbollah has joined the fight, and the interceptors have continued to dwindle. So more and more of the strikes, even in barrages of 1 to 2 missiles, usually if 2 missiles, one of them strikes down and hits its target. So with these major losses from the United States and the dwindling interceptors, how do you think this conflict goes from the perspective of the aggressors, the Zionist Jewish American Empire?
Yeah, well, looking at the losses, the death count, of course, of Americans in the Purim War has already increased to at least 11 confirmed. That's the 6 men and women.
I think it's 14 now, actually.
Well, definitely they've been actually revealing more and more names of actually Americans being killed, both in the Gulf states and obviously the 6 who are included on the KC 135 refueler. But just to keep this in perspective, the Americans have over, at least at this point, over 50 refuelers flying around the Middle East. And in general, the American Air Force has over 350 of these massive planes refueling the bombing sorties that the Americans and the Israelis, most likely they are coordinating with one another. Because as Pete Hegseth himself has confirmed, when the Iranians look up, they see the stars and stripes and the Star of David overhead. So Pete Hegseth has basically confirmed that the American and the Israeli Air Force are working in conjunction together. And we'll sort of speak about the various bombing sorties that the Americans have been carrying out, because not just on urban targets around Tehran, but also on those mountainous subterranean places of hiding where the Iranians are, of course, storing their ballistic missiles, and that they've been building up some of those ballistic missile factories and all kinds of launch facilities that have been basically covertly hidden in case of essentially just what's happening right now, and basically an aerial invasion of Iranian airspace, which has also pretty much all but being confirmed this week. The Americans are actually flying well across the Iranian territory at nighttime typically and actually bombing Iranian targets. But of course, this is horrific, the tragedy of just more and more American lives being taken. And yes, this KC-135 refueler was shot down over western Iraq, which is again a very curious location. Notice it's further away from Iran. It is basically near Jordan, next to Syria, in places where you'd think the Americans would have full control. And the official narrative naturally was that, well, the pro-Iranian narrative that was launched shortly after the plane actually fell to the ground and was destroyed was that, well, it was the IRGC militias that shot it down, or it was Iran. However, the Americans released a very interesting narrative that said basically it was a collision that happened mid-air, which is quite strange. You'd think, why are these 2 massive Boeing refuelers flying even close to each other, which is very bizarre in the first place. They'd need to have at least some distance. And obviously the Americans have been using these planes since the late 1950s. So they've been they've been up and about for over 70 years at this point. They've literally outlived the Cold War. You'd think the American pilots would have more training than that. So again, the narrative story that has been released this week about the alleged collision in the air is a little bit difficult to believe. In any case, this is the first major aerial loss that the Americans have suffered, and probably one of the many, because we recall during the Gulf War in 1991, the Americans lost over 30 aircraft confirmed, possibly even more based on Iraqi sources. And so this is only the beginning of potentially more and more American hardware being lost for a war, really, that's, as we understand, being carried out for the sake of Israel and basically Israeli cultural and civilizational expansion, which recently on the Piers Morgan show, there was that interview of the Zionist woman who basically confirmed, yes, the Talmudic prophecies do say that Israel needs to be expanded from the Euphrates to the Nile, like openly claiming that to Piers Morgan, who I think was taken aback a little bit because it's not just from the so-called river to the sea that Israel needs to spread, taking, of course, Gaza, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, but also territories which literally belong to Israel's so-called allies, even including the Wahhabi and Salafis who've taken over Syria, or even the loyal Jordanians under King Abdullah II. In any case, these particular reports have only, of course, shown us that the Israelis well and truly are utilizing the Americans as their muzzle dogs on long leads in order to bomb the Iranians into submission. And just as we reported last week, of course, the main concern of the Americans is to take out as many of these ballistic launch missile sites as possible before any sort of ground operations can take place. And one of course, the craziest stories that's just been released, and this may, of course, come with some delay, or maybe this entire story, Conrad, I think it could be essentially a foreshadowing of a future land invasion, is that the American Marine Expeditionary Unit stationed in Asia, the 31st Unit, comprising of 5,000 personnel and over 2,200 Marines. So this is an amphibian invasion force with 3 ships, is traveling from Asia to the Persian Gulf, or at least to the Sea of Arabia, in order to carry out some sort of expeditionary project. And this was leaked by the Wall Street Journal. And as we understand, Conrad, most of these massive publications, when they do leak these stories, it's usually with the blessing of the State Department. So the real question is this entire story a massive distraction? Because some of the Austin geopolitical analysts, they are saying that for this force of 5,000 Marines to actually get to the Sea of Arabia, to the Persian Gulf, it will take them between 10 and 14 days. So it's not like these Marines are just going to be deployed tomorrow. It'll be 1 or 2 episodes of World War now away, maybe by the 4th week of the war. And literally a month into it, we'll see them in action. But there's still questions about what exactly the American paratroop is going to do, the 82nd Brigade. So this is very, very interesting developments. And as we understand, the Americans have been bombing the coastal regions of Iran more and more intensely, almost preparing, like plowing the fields and making sure the Iranians, at least on the ground in some of these coastal areas, which are really key to securing the Straits of Hormuz, don't have any naval facilities there to potentially impact any of the shipping lanes or even put the lives of these Americans in danger when the actual amphibian operations do commence. In terms of world trade, Conrad, I think it's just been a crazy week. There's been over 3 ships that were severely damaged, basically destroyed in the Persian Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz. Overall, 19 commercial vessels have been damaged. Allegedly, there are reports out of the UK that, the insurance brokers around the world, the insurance companies have sorted out the wartime insurance. They've all raised their rates and things like that. They've sorted out the financial side. But now, in terms of commercialization of the Persian Gulf and all the vessels traveling through it, the next consideration is to actually protect them from Iranian missiles, from Iranian drones, and even potentially maybe even Iranian mines that have been placed in the Straits of Hormuz. Now, the mining hasn't been as intense as what we initially thought, and the main reason for that, as you mentioned, Conrad, correctly, is because Iran is actually allowing Russian, Chinese vessels and vessels from several other countries, including Pakistan, to actually leave the Straits of Hormuz unharassed. And most likely, they need to announce themselves ahead of time to the Iranians to sort of signal that, look, we're actually ships of allied nations, and Iran, please don't strike us, the IRGC Navy, to actually stand back and not to hurt them. But the real consideration here is if they can't openly mine the entire straits, that would put the vessels of their allies at risk, but also it shows you, I think, the level of Chinese pressure, right? The Chinese economic giant, which has been providing Iran with so much support over the last few decades, has asked the Iranians for a favor to actually allow the straits to operate to some minimalistic capacity in order to keep the world economy running and actually to minimize the damage done to China. I think the most impressive thing I'll just mention in terms of commerce is the fact that crude oil just now has reached $99 American. And yes, it's fallen just over the last hour to $98.7. But yes, it's well and truly up there, and people are estimating that obviously Russia will be the greatest beneficiary of this apparently. And I mean, these estimates are, I think, a bit hyperbolic, but they're claiming Russia could generate as much as 300 million American dollars per day from its oil sales now that the price has risen so astronomically high. But in fact, I think the real numbers are somewhere around 150, $200 million per day that Russia will generate. Yes, this doesn't make up for all of the investitures that Russia has lost during the beginning of the SMO in all of those brokerage firms and investment banks in Western Europe, which are now obviously under the control of Brussels and the EU. However, it does make up a lot of those losses carried out during the course of the war and, over the 220,000 plus sanctions. So basically the economic pressure on Russia is loosening, and which means that inevitably, I think, as soon as Russia begins supporting Iran, you'll see the Americans and the Israelis kind of losing their grip on the situation. Because look, Iran and Russia are very close. In some ways, I think, and this is Kirill Dmitriev's doing, because he traveled to Washington this week to probably coordinate a sort of loosening of the sanctions on Russia until the 11th of April. So Russia is able to trade crude oil for the first time in an unsanctioned way for the next month. And I think the Americans are expecting Russia not to support Iran in any sort of extreme capacity, to not be, of course, giving them intelligence. I mean, who knows? Did they do a pinky promise? Did they sign a document? We don't know. I mean, Kirill Dmitriev most likely coordinated this without any signatures, most likely just gave a good faith promise to the Americans that Russia won't be supporting Iran as much as it has been throughout the last few years. But I think, look, the Americans have broken their word. European NATO countries have lied about Ukraine, have lied about Minsk 1 and 2. There's no reason why Russia shouldn't, for example, use its own deceptive tactics in supporting Iran, even if they've made this minor economic deal behind the scenes. But in any case, at the moment, Russia is benefiting from all of these tensions in the Middle East, while the entire world, especially Europe is the main loser here. And every country is feeling the increased oil and gasoline prices. So, most of us regular folks, we drive our cars, we drive diesel, gas, regular petrol. It's all going up in prices. And we're all feeling the impacts from the decision of Donald J. Trump to follow, Bibi Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, and all these other people with demonic names in Israel to carry on with this third world war in the Middle East, which nobody really asked for. And this is not what the Americans voted for in late 2024 after Trump survived his assassination. So this is the continuation of a massive betrayal of American trust, especially the trust of right-wing conservative Americans. And yes, we are now consuming the fruits of that betrayal, unfortunately. Even those of us living in sort of Western countries far away from the conflict, everybody's feeling what's about to happen. And, the heartbeat of the world economy is slowing down.
No, the Iranians have told us to expect $150 to $200 oil prices per barrel coming in the next few weeks. So that will be devastating to the U.S. economy. Of course, there will be no walk in the park for China either. We've seen long lines there for gas already, but more of their ships are being allowed through than anybody else's. Of course, Turkish ships have even been allowed through. That's another thing we're going to have to get into in this episode, is Iran has vehemently denied the attempted drone and missile strikes on Turkish bases, Azeri bases, and almost most importantly, the Omani oil infrastructure, which was struck by, at the very least, Shahed lookalike drones. I suspect the Lucas drones used by Israel and the United States were used to strike the major Omani oil refinement and production facilities there. Those were some of the craziest videos, hitting the oil holding tanks there, just exploding on the coast of Oman down there, right outside the Straits of Hormuz itself. So major escalations. They claim the Israeli drones have also been the ones striking a lot of the oil infrastructure initially, now that both sides have escalated it to that point. So much like people think that Israel is trying to drag other countries into the war, even with the potential strikes on the Cyprus bases, we assume those are likely from Hezbollah. It's clear that Turkish involvement, the triggering of Article 5 of NATO with Iran attacking Turkey, that would be the easiest way that, look, now that the Kurdish, Azeri, Balochi kind of separatist minority plan sort of failed, seems the most likely successful option now is going to be the action of an actual NATO Turkish force, which in theory you could bolster with any number of other NATO countries. Of course, we're going to discuss the Lebanon situation. The Syrian military, supposedly, rumors are that they're going to assist the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. So that will be a sight to see, but we're going to stick in the Persian Gulf here for a second. And as far as the USS Abraham Lincoln goes, perhaps this is even another reason that Trump was angered and was prompted to deploy these Marine ground troops potentially to go onto Karg Island or these other islands, Kish Island, Siri Island, some of these islands even closer to the United Arab Emirates, that would be much easier to take. Iran would have a harder time defending them from their coast. Obviously, they're fully within the range of all of these missiles. And as Dmitry and I were discussing off air, fully within the range of Russian medium-range ballistic missiles, hypersonics. Again, it's only, about double the length away as certain targets in Ukraine are for certain Russian bases. So much more in range than America or even Western Europe is for a lot of Russian things. So we're going to discuss some of those prophecies here as well. But I mentioned this on previous episodes. I did from a trustworthy source from Mount Athos, told me that a Greek captain and a Greek admiral, these are high-ranking naval officials in Greece, did confirm that the bridge of the USS Abraham Lincoln was severely damaged and has been taken out of the theater of conflict. And that's one of the reasons why the George HW Bush was deployed. Of course, right now I mentioned how the Gerald R Ford, the longest currently deployed, they're serving the longest deployment of any American aircraft carrier in naval history. They are, of course, 88 miles off the coast of Saudi Arabia, preparing to intercept Houthi missiles. Mohammed al-Boukhiti, a senior Ansarullah official, said that a decision has been made to stand militarily with Iran, and 0 hour will be announced at the right time. Of course, we have heard the reports of the crew-started fire on board the USS Gerald R Ford that they claimed was not started by any kind of enemy attack or anything like that. It was the reports that the crew there are close to mutiny. They really need to go home. They don't seem to support the conflict. I mean, what is it, like 25% of the American people currently supporting this war with Iran? So that is the unfortunate reality there. But that's why, of course, they're bringing in the HW Bush. They got to get the Ford out of there. But as the Houthis prepare to enter the conflict, and as the Iranians claim they still have these tricks up their sleeves, they claim they still even haven't used all of the weapons that they have, it's clear that Trump is going to be reticent to take any of these forces out of the theater of conflict, and he's going to want them to protect these new amphibious forces that are potentially going to be used on Karg Island, which today Trump confirmed, mere hours before we were recording this, major U.S. strikes. He claimed that like 90% of the island was struck. They destroyed all the military capabilities but spared the oil, whereas immediately the Iranians said this is a lie. Our defenses are still capable there. An hour after the strikes, our defenses were active. So again, more information warfare, psyops, disputes. That's a whole big part of this. We're going to be discussing whether or not Itamar Ben-Gvir and Benjamin Netanyahu are dead or severely injured. There are a lot of evidence to put forward something like this. But again, this could all also be psychological warfare. But I just wanted to reiterate, as we prepare for these potential land invasions and these troops on the ground on Iranian territory, this is from phase 3 of Elder Joseph of Vatopedi's 7 phases of World War III that he prophesied. He said then the Russians will move south to help their allies, especially the Iranians, who will be under attack by the Americans. The Americans will have occupied Iran's coastal zone after a fierce struggle, but they will not be able to advance inland due to strong resistance they will face. The Russians will sweep through Persia and destroy the American/NATO forces. And then talks about going into Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Kuwait, and finally Israel, which then relates to, of course, St. Philomenos of Jacob's Wells prophecies about how the Russians will make it all the way down to Mount Tabor, all the way down to Israel. That's the farthest that they will make as they sweep down to fight the Turks. But I think potentially these Karg Island invasions, those could be the first step. Maybe a few months later they move to the coastal regions, or maybe the Karg Island invasion itself doesn't happen for several more weeks. Trump initially claimed that by the end of March, we would be seeing American naval escorts of international ships and oil shipments through the straits. Trump claims that might be happening sooner rather than later now. So again, I think this is all a bunch of wild, spastic flailing around from Trump. I have my own sort of perspective on why the war is going the way that it's going and why the U.S., the most formidable military in the world, was allowed to stumble into this ridiculous Jewish war. It's obviously part of the reasons why is that it is not for any American interests, but for Jewish interests. But I think these prophecies from Elder Joseph and St. Philomenos are going to become very relevant very soon. But I don't think we would necessarily see extensive Russian ground movements down into the region. I could easily see strikes on American forces if they really start moving hard into Iran. But I don't see any of those things necessarily happening with Russia realizing the true threat until Erdogan falls and he is replaced by these Kemalists. But in the midst of Erdogan's claims that he is resisting all efforts to drag Turkey into this war, he said that we will not be dragged into a war. We are prepared for all capabilities, but he's very much trying to nip rumors and kind of talk about NATO Article 5 being invoked in the bud. So I could see potentially further false flag, maybe a major strike against Turkey. And the people are like, we need to go to war with Iran, but Erdogan resists. Maybe people take to the streets. Then you see another strike, supposedly from Iran, but obviously actually from Israel, kills maybe pro-Kemalist protesters. Next thing you know, Erdogan is taken out. Erdogan is killed in a strike, not super different from that, like those on the Hamas fighters. I mean, Israel already claimed when they struck Qatar and these other places and killed Hamas officials that they were actually about to strike Turkey instead of Qatar. But I think we're convinced by other forces not to do that. So Turkey is very much next on Israel's hit list. If Israel is going to start striking any other country legitimately, I think it is going to be Turkey. So we're going to be watching all of that very closely. But if Erdogan does fall, and then next thing you know, you have a Kemalist anti-Russian NATO army about to move into Iran, I think the Russians might seriously start to reassess how committed they are to all of this multipolarity stuff. But as far as Trump stumbling into this, just remember that we are willing to stumble into this war during a midterm year. It's 2026. Apparently, the reason we can't do mass deportations, the reason we never even got above 700 deportations a day, and the moment Alex Priddy and Renee Good got shot, we had to completely withdraw from Minneapolis because it's the midterms. We can't lose the House and the Senate. These are unpopular things. We're going to get swept if we just continue on this path of the show of forces and these mass ICE raids and dragging people out in the streets. Meanwhile, we're going to commit to a war with Iran that helps nobody. We're going to kill hundreds of American soldiers in a war that has less than 25% support. And why is that? Well, it's because who really pulls the strings here? Is it the American people that en masse, 60, 75% of the American people demand mass deportations, demand a reduction in the amount of people in this country? No, they're not in control. Jews are in control. And what do Jews want? They want us to destroy Iran for Israel. So that's why it doesn't matter that it's an election year. It doesn't matter that it's unpopular. We got Trump and J.D. Vance in there for one purpose and one purpose alone, and that is to restore greater Israel, destroy Iran, allow Israel to do what they want to do in Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanon and Syria, to help us and sacrifice American lives, Goyim blood, to take out the Persians, fellow Aryans. That's what's literally happening right now. And why was it allowed to be planned so poorly? Why was it, despite months and months of meetings from Netanyahu and Trump, was it allowed to be this horrible, unmitigated disaster? It's because that's what the Jews wanted. The Jews didn't want another repeat of the 12-day war, Operation Midnight Hammer, a quick strike. Trump claims political victory, and the Iranians live to fight another day and continue to prepare potentially a crypto-nuclear program. No, they want America to get dragged into another Iraq, to turn Iran into this battlefield, to either facilitate liberal regime change or to balkanize it entirely. So the Israelis either gave faulty intelligence or encouraged people to be promoted within the Pentagon and within the State Department that are incompetent, that would unwittingly get us into this situation, have an early failure to allow us to get into a protracted conflict, troops on the ground, other countries getting involved to allow them to then expand their war against Lebanon, expand their war against Turkey, Syria, other regional rivals, all falling exactly into Israel's plan while Trump stumbles into this, making false statements. Remember when we claimed to have destroyed 90% of Iran's missile launchers in the first few days? Mm-hmm. Now the claim is we may have gotten up to 60% of them. The answer really is they have absolutely no idea. They claim to have air superiority within the first 3 days. We see Iranian jets up. We saw Iranian missile and air defenses active today over areas even in Western Iran, so areas close to Israel and the United States. So most of what we're getting out of the United States and Israel is total propaganda. We have no idea what a lot of the ground looks like in Israel as they've come under intense fire from Iranians and Hezbollah, who again, we've heard that Hezbollah was destroyed. I post my Orthodox Hezbollah shirt. People say, you people got destroyed. Nasrallah was killed. Hezbollah is completely irrelevant now. Well, they were able to launch a 100 missile salvo all at once into Israel. Dozens of interceptions. Kiryat Shmona, complete military censorship. We have no idea what it looks like. Some of the most incredible, beautiful footage I've ever seen in my life of Hezbollah missiles flying through the sky of Israel as Jews gasp in fear and maybe for 5 seconds feel what it must have felt like to be an innocent person in Gaza watching your people get genocided. And of course, Naim Qassem, current Secretary General of Hezbollah, successor to Hassan Nasrallah, has released many statements. He's been warned that he is a target of assassination. Of course, he knows this. You got the Ayatollah. You think the head of Hezbollah is not ready and prepared for assassination? But he issued a strong warning to Benjamin Netanyahu. This is from Press TV. He said, your threat to assassinate me has no taste and no value. You are the one who should fear for yourself, Sheikh Naim Qassem said during an address on Friday. He reaffirmed Hezbollah's determination, stating there's no such thing as defeat or surrender in our dictionary. We will remain strong in the field no matter the sacrifices and offerings. We will not retreat because this concerns our existence. This is an existential battle, not a limited or simple battle. And of course, at this point, 5, 6, maybe even up to 7 major Israeli ground incursions into southern Lebanon that the Radwan Hezbollah forces have definitively pushed back. We have stories of major Israeli casualties, multiple Apache helicopters shot down. And of course, the news story is that the Syrian army, Al-Jalani's Shabbos Goyim, will be moving in with the IDF into Lebanon as Israel prepares its massive ground invasion force. The rumors are that the Americans have given it the green light. Their only demand is that the Israelis cannot strike or damage the Beirut International Airport. So they'll be striking all over Beirut, all over southern Lebanon. They've openly stated that Lebanese government officials, including those that are against Hezbollah, Joseph Ayoun, the Lebanese forces, these people will all be legitimate targets because, again, I don't know how many times I try to explain to the Maronite Shabbos Goyim and the other stupid Christians and Sunnis that exist in Lebanon and want to fight against Hezbollah and support the Jews against the Shia. They don't view you as any different. You're all Goyim cattle to them. You are all Amalek. You are all idol worshippers. Most of the Christians and the Shia in particular, but definitely the Christians. And you need to not be using this as an opportunity to stab those resisting Jewry in the back and be golems yourself. You need to align as Lebanese people. You can fight your sectarian differences after the Zionist entity and those that are literally invading your country and desecrating your churches have been defeated with the help of Syrian Muslim head choppers. So these people claim to be against Islam. Meanwhile, they're going to be fighting with who? With Sunni Wahhabis and Zionist Jews against Orthodox Christians and Shia. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. If you're one of these Maronite Lebanese forces, Shabbos Goyim, saying how Hezbollah and Israel are equally your enemies, you deserve to be ruled over. You are a gay raped slave. That is really the only thing that I have to say to you. And of course, all of this is downstream from the Greater Israel Project. We have people claiming that, oh, well, radical Islam is just as much of a problem as Jewry. No, it is not. Before the Nakba, before 1948, there were more Christians, there was more peace in the region, even under the Ottomans, who we despise, even under the British Mandate, which was a problem. These situations were all better than what happened after the Rothschild-recognized Zionist entity came into power with the backing of both the Soviet Union and the Western capitalist forces, because fundamentally, Zionism, this is the reason that atheist, a secularist like Benjamin Netanyahu invokes the Third Temple and Zionism and the Jewish religion, and the majority of Jews who don't even believe in God can still unite with these insane Hasidim and these insane Chabad Lubavitchers to pursue this religious, messianic world dominion project is because, unlike Christians, unlike those of us who believe in the prophecies, who believe that Jesus has already come and risen from the dead, the Jews believe that their prophecy and their Messiah comes from will to power. You have Ronald Lauder, heir of the Estee Lauder fortune. You have the Rothschilds, fundamentally the richest, most asset-wealthy people in the world. Larry Fink, manager of the largest assets in the world. These are the most powerful people that have ever existed in human society, and they're united behind this goal. And that's why these rich people can have these insane beliefs about, I mean, look, you saw what Chris Christie said in the past few weeks in this interview about how Charles Kushner and Jared and Trump, they were mad at Chris Christie and forced him out of the Trump administration because he prosecuted Charles Kushner for securities fraud. Whereas Jared and Charles thought that should be left to the rabbis, that these people should be only held accountable within their own Jewish law, because that's what they want. They want to invoke these Noahide laws and rule over us. And fundamentally, even if these people don't believe in a God or a higher power, because they recognize that all Jews have been pursuing this tikkun olam vision, and so many of them operate in the highest echelons of power, as I just mentioned, with Rothschild and world finance and politics and Hollywood and everything. They realize that they can put their faith in this future building of the Third Temple, and maybe a great man, as this Antichrist, their Messiah, will come and rise up, and they can will that to power. It's the complete opposite of the Christian perspective. We believe that Christ has already won the victory, and we're literally waiting for his supernatural return in the sky, in the clouds. There will be no political ascension. There will be no debate. Every knee shall bow. That's not what the Jews believe. They believe something fundamentally different, and for many of them, it is not religious, but it is able to become this religious project because in many ways Jews are sort of these Nietzscheans who are operating entirely within this material realm, alchemically transmutating the world mind to fit their agenda. So I think everybody needs to be aware of that. And we're seeing all sorts of infighting right now within the Christian world. Of course, Christian Zionism is still on the back foot, I think, in many ways. But you see Doug Wilson and all the, of course, people in the Trump administration, Pete Hegseth, who is a CREC attendee, of which Doug Wilson is a pastor. And Doug Wilson is going on things talking about how he's going to ban, obviously, Muslim call to prayer as a Christian nationalist, but also Catholic Marian processions, icon processions, and these sorts of things, because we're going to be Protestant. But I noticed how he didn't address Jewish kosher slaughter, or if he's going to be banning other Jewish expressions, because he, of course, himself somewhat identifies as ethnically Jewish. He is, of course, a big friend of Israel. And again, is in favor of Pete Hegseth, who has the kafir tattoo and is a big major Zionist. So Doug Wilson is trying to coalesce this new Christian, it's a little bit less crazy than dispensationalists, but still, Christian support for Israel. But I know I've been yapping all over the place, Dmitry. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these rumors about Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir being assassinated. Of course, with the Iranian and Hezbollah double barrages, they have reportedly been coordinating their strikes. It would not surprise me if certain major Israeli officials had come under fire. Of course, it's been 2 days, I believe, since Netanyahu was seen in public visiting these ruins of these strikes, an area where I think 9 Israelis were killed. I think the death count might have risen since then. He then, of course, released this major speech talking about how the Messiah is not going to come yet. We will, not going to come in the next 2 weeks. We have things to do before then, basically openly discussing how they're preparing to building the third temple and talking about greater Israel. But it was realized that that video was likely AI. He had vanishing teeth. At one point, he had 6 fingers. So it seems to be that something happened to Netanyahu. And if he's not dead, some say he might have been deeply wounded or disfigured, or maybe he's in a coma. And very similar rumors have emerged for Itamar Ben-Gvir, one of the most odious Jewish Zionists that, frankly, has ever walked the earth. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on these two characters, as well as our new, somewhat shadowy, enigmatic Basiji Ayatollah, who was also reportedly wounded in strikes and has only released text-based statements for now. So your thoughts on these figures and anything else you want to continue discussing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's really interesting how that video does have signs of essentially AI tampering at the very least. So whether or not Netanyahu himself, of course, is in a coma or if he's active and he just wanted to, of course, release an AI video for whatever reason, maybe he is just too busy, coordinating the defense of the Israeli people to actually give a 10-minute plus speech to be posted online. It's very, very strange. And he himself, obviously, Netanyahu is quite an old politician at this point, but a very open public speaker. He speaks in the English language. He can probably speak in fluent Russian as well if he tried. He gives speeches in Hebrew, and he is a big media figure. And for him to sort of fake something with AI, that's something we expect from figures literally who are fake media personalities like Zelensky. We've had US allies, for example, in Ukraine, literally fake presentations before. Zelensky has used green screen. He literally copy pasted himself. And we've seen Zelensky next to a downed Russian Shahed drone, which literally wasn't the size of a Shahed. It was maybe a quarter of the size. We've seen all kinds of weird things. Zelensky on the front lines in Pokrovsk and in Toretsk, all these other weird, and on the outskirts of Kupiansk, for example, whilst the Russians held control of the central city, which is completely insane. It's within 50 kilometers of a Russian missile strike. Unrealistic expectations have always been set by, unfortunately, the Talmudic state of Israel and its allies, one of which is, of course, Ukraine. And we understand that now because Ukraine has openly stated it stands against Iran and has apparently given drone technologies to some of the Gulf states in order for them to, especially some drone interceptor technologies, which have apparently, assisted the Gulf states in defending themselves. Because one of the biggest expectations, Conrad, from this war, and our listeners will probably appreciate it, as we've said it on live streams multiple times, is the limited capacity for interceptors to actually take down these constant ballistic missile and drone barrages that Iran is sending at these nations in somewhat incremental proportions, which means that the air defense missiles literally overreact and sometimes shoot too many interceptors into the air. And one of these missiles is, of course, worth significantly less than the Shahed drones, which are only $20,000 to $30,000 American dollars, whilst the missile itself is in the millions. So as you can see, the absence of a huge stockpile of interceptors in the Gulf states is a huge issue, which has been flagged even by pro-American and I would say pro-Gulf state, pro-Israeli spokespersons. But we'll discuss the bombing of Iran in a little moment because the Americans have confirmed that they have been using those long-range stealth fighters, especially the B-1s and the B-2 bombers actively. And that's already, we've had rumors in the first week, but now it's pretty much confirmed that at nighttime, there are these long-range aerial sorties, sometimes taking as long as there was actually a Wild Weasel pilot, so that's an F-15 support plane, and he openly stated, and again, this is not really confirmed, so, this could be a rumor, but he said the longest sortie he's carried out was actually this week in his entire life over Iran, and he said that he refueled multiple times. He was supporting a group of 4 F-15 Strike Eagles, which were dropping GBU-31 bombs. So these are not the same big penetrating bombs like the GBU-57s, but these GBU bombs of a much lighter size. He was supporting these Strike Eagles, essentially dropping them on Iranian mountainous territory. But he also said that these particular exhausting sorties, they do take multiple hours. Literally the plane is in the air for over an entire workday, and there's all this potential for the Iranians to shoot them down and how stressful all of this may be. And again, he said the most interesting thing that he's experienced is, again, these long-range B-1 bombers and the B-2 bombers and the B-52 bombers specifically. So they look like those Russian nuclear bombers that Ukraine took out. Remember, Ukraine destroyed 7 to 8 of them in Operation Spiderweb last year. in those Siberian bases and northern bases. It was basically across all of Russia. But the B-52 bombers with the incredible wingspan of 56 meters are actually stationed at the British Royal Air Force Base. So they're actually stationed in the UK, and they fly across all of Europe at the Fairford base. They get refueled multiple times. Obviously, the Americans have a huge fleet of these massive aerial refuelers. And at nighttime, typically between midnight and dawn, they strike, they fly over Iran, and they bomb these mountainous facilities, dropping in tonnages of explosives, trying to get through these mountainous bunkers and trying to penetrate deep into Iranian defenses. And usually, obviously, they wouldn't drop such huge payloads over urban territories, but we've had reports from cities like Tehran, Isfahan, and even some religious strike sites like Qom have been hit very heavily. So again, the question is, who is exactly hitting these urban cities as opposed to some of the mountainous, more like militarized sites? Obviously, that would be a war crime, but we have seen Israel, of course, strike literally apartment buildings and destroy homes all over Gaza for the last 3 years. So what can be really surprising at this point? In any case, it's pretty much confirmed now that the US is using the entire aerial dominance that it has developed over the last few decades, sort of building up to previous conflicts like in Iraq, the Gulf War. The Americans are utilizing its air force to the fullest capacity at this moment, considering that they only have 2 aircraft carriers anywhere near Iran, unlike the previous conflicts. In fact, the US fleet, and this may show, Conrad, that Trump was perhaps partially unprepared for this conflict. The number of US ships in range of Iran are roughly between 15 and 20. These are including, of course, the destroyers that they have, the aircraft carriers, and some of the frigates and corvettes and the refueling naval vessels, as compared to, for example, the Gulf War, when the Americans had a naval fleet of over 110 ships located in the Persian Gulf and in the Eastern Mediterranean, which is a huge disparity. As you can see, it's almost just 20% of what the US had just 3 decades ago. Whether or not this points towards a deterioration of US naval capacity, or maybe just Trump being unprepared, maybe him depending on the surprise strike to take out Khamenei, the supreme leader, it's really unclear. But just wanted to mention the so-called alleged operation of Karg Island, which Trump himself tweeted about. Apparently, all of the Iranian military bases and all the military personnel have been actually annihilated, destroyed in Karg Island. But the population of the island itself, just the general, regular civilians, are numbered over 8,000. So this isn't just a desolate island with some massive petrol stations and, oil refineries and oil storage facilities. It's actually it has coastal towns, has restaurants, as you mentioned off air, Conrad, there are people living there who probably work the local jobs. From what we can understand, most likely the Americans will be using those Marine Expeditionary Forces to hold Karg Island hostage. In my opinion, and I guess we'll see in the next 7 to 14 days as how this exactly plays out. But if the Americans do land on Karg Island, if they do position themselves around some of these oil facilities, they will be most likely betting that the Iranians will not be bombing their own oil capacity. And also, keep in mind, 90% of Iran's oil actually passes through Karg Island or uses the island storage facilities. And that's 90% of that oil. Most of it goes towards China. So would Iran, in fact, given the civilizational scope of the conflict here, and as you mentioned, Conrad, given the prophecies, would Iran actually bomb its own island to destroy its own export facilities in order to hurt the Americans? Because if anything, the Americans are going to take the island, they're going to hold the civilians hostage, they're going to hold the Iranian oil facilities hostage, and they're going to hope that the Iranians are not crazy enough to send the entire world energy economy into a recession dumpster, right? Which I think the Iranians at this point, given the disrespect, given the total number of casualties, numbering well over 2,000 with at least 200 children killed as well, confirmed by the Red Crescent in Iran as of this week. So the casualty numbers are increasing by 700 to 800 per week. And most likely that'll continue to escalate given the huge bombing campaigns the Americans have been carrying out. It does appear that Karg Island and those 8,000 Iranians living there may be a future target for the Americans, potentially even of this amphibious operation. And who knows, as you mentioned, the Ereshnik does have a strike range of over allegedly up to 5,000 kilometers. And Karg Island from Kapustin Yar in Astrahan, what's a distance there over the Caspian Sea, over the territory of Azerbaijan, Armenia, all of Iran? It's only about 1,500 kilometers, maybe 2,000 kilometers at most flight range. So the Ereshnik strike from Astrahan, from Kapustin Yar, which struck 1,000 kilometers into Dnipro to the west, when it, of course, struck at both Dnipro and outside of Lvov. It's exactly the same range, but instead of west, the Russians will be striking potentially any sort of Americans positioned on that coastline near Bushehr. That's the other interesting thing, is the Bushehr Peninsula, right? That is the That is roughly 35 kilometers away from Karg Island. That is one of the main trading port cities of Iran. And that is exactly where the Russian nuclear reactor is located. If you look at the Bushehr Peninsula, it's just on the southern tip of that peninsula. And it's a massive city. You'd think the Americans could maybe just land in Bushehr and just secure this particular peninsula, similar to how the Russians did in 2014 when they liberated Crimea. But that simply won't be possible. The population of Bushehr is over 200,000. They all obviously are very patriotic, at least a good proportion of them. They most likely greatly dislike Americans. You'd need tens of thousands of American troops, even if the 82nd Airborne is dropped off in Bushehr to secure this location. And that could be one of the motivations for the Russians using an Oreshnik or an intermediate strike missile, because, well, Russian economic, Russian potentially Rosatom energy interests, the Russian atomic secrets may be in danger if the Americans try to take that newly built nuclear reactor located there. The other thing people are just not considering, I think, is just the population of Iran. I mean, it's between 90 and 100 million people. It's huge. And so the coastal cities that the Americans may be targeting in these future amphibian strikes, and even these islands, the island of Keshem, for example, has hundreds of thousands of people living there. The city of Bandar Abbas has 500,000 people living there, which is enormous. Like, these are just massive cities, not just coastal towns. So securing them, or even pushing any sort of depopulation strategies to try to push the Iranians further inland to make room for an American amphibian invasion of the coastal cities will, just to secure the Straits of Hormuz, to give it this humanitarian, world peacekeeping, economic sort of look, will result in tens of thousands of Iranians, at the very least, being displaced. And yes, if this war progresses, and I'll use some of Igor Strelkov's analysis, he says that there'll be an increase in epidemics, there'll be an increase in water shortages, there'll be huge humanitarian crises. If you recall, there were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands allegedly of people who were dying after the 2003 Iraq war from simple absence of food and absence of nutrition, things like this, just medicines, absence of medicine, etc. And the same thing may, of course, impact cities like Bushehr and Bandar Abbas if the Americans actually choose to continue striking them as they have. And yes, this is despite the fact that allegedly the Iranian Navy has been completely disabled. 44 to 45 of the Iranian ships have been taken out. Most of the Iranian small submarines have been, of course, destroyed. And they're actually striking at every single ship they can find. Anything, even boats that look like they could, of course, be facilitating any sort of mine transportation in the Straits of Hormuz, are being targeted by Israeli and American planes. So it's really well and truly a predatory strike against the coastal population of Iran. And there could be, literally the population of Gaza could be at risk, at least on the Iranian coastal side, because for example, Bushehr and Bandar Abbas, people have lived in these cities. Like, these cities are ancient. They go back to Cyrus the Great, literally 600 BC, probably to the times of Gilgamesh and Enkidu. So you really have layers and layers of population living there, burying their dead, building their holy religious sites, things like this. And of course, with such disrespectful strikes by America against so-called IRGC bases, which pose a threat to, global economic dominance after an unprecedented American-Israeli joint strike on the eve of Purim, you can kind of understand how the Iranians are not just going to abandon some of the most ancient cities simply because, the Americans will show some force of aggression. And I think the Karg Island hypothesis, Conrad, it most likely will be to essentially muzzle and hold China in a sort of economic hostage situation, because most of Iran's oil going to China, of course, passes through Karg Island. If the Americans can secure it, they can have China potentially apply more diplomatic economic pressure upon Iran and sort of force them to their knees. But as you said, the new Ayatollah, the supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, he is someone who's apparently lost his wife. At least she was one of the victims of the school bombing on the eve of Purim. Initially, there's reports that his mother, of course, the wife of the former supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, she perished. Some of his relatives have died. This is someone who potentially has nothing more to lose except for his religious honor and his morality. So this is someone who potentially will go all the way, and most likely, despite Pezeshkian, of course, giving these weird symbols, apologizing to the Gulf states as he did last week, none of this will fall in line with how Mojtaba Khamenei and the new supreme leader, and probably his miniature SS sort of IRGC loyal army, they will not take any sort of diplomatic resolution until, of course, every American base is removed from the Middle East, literally. And as some IRGC spokespersons have said, Conrad, very radically, they've said, yeah, the war is not stopping until Israel is destroyed. Like, the entire country will be completely gone. It'll turn into Palestine again. So the stakes are incredibly high for both sides. And I'm not sure if Trump and Netanyahu actually understood what they were getting into initially, because they have basically upset and triggered an entire wasp hive of essentially now radicalized Shia patriots who these Persians will be taking things to the nth degree. They'll be, of course, pushing for a complete demilitarization, similar to how Vladimir Putin is now focusing on a hyper demilitarization of Ukraine. The Iranians will be doing the same. And yes, the only thing they can really do is continue to carpet bomb all of these underground facilities to continue to attempt to defang Iran. And yes, the fog of war is so thick, we can only hear these anecdotal stories about these nighttime bombing raids and campaigns by the Americans, and these stories about the GBU deep penetration bombs being dropped on Iranian facilities, but there is no footage. We either have to trust the IRGC sources or we have to trust the Americans, who sadly at this point the American controlled media is well and truly subjugated to the Israeli cause. So again, the fog of war is incredibly dense, but the war, this is of course much grander than the 12-day war. And as we're recording this on literally the 13th day going into the 14th day, it's incredibly bloody, and it has already surpassed previous Middle East conflicts. Now, we're not really at the stage of it being larger than the 2003 Iraq war, but I think give this war a few more weeks and well and truly it could surpass even that, especially if Trump begins to bring in troops on the ground, more aircraft carriers, more naval vessels in order to, again, push his agenda, which now appears to be, well, he wants economic prosperity for everybody, which means to completely behead the entire so-called Iranian radical regime, which he's been calling for since the beginning, since that 8-minute speech that he released. So a lot of the onus and the responsibility for this entire war for all the Americans, it's all on Donald J. Trump's shoulders, which is quite a shame because this is not what Americans voted for.
No, at the end of the day, sure, we can blame the Jews as much as we want. They're the ones that dragged us into this, but Trump promised America first, and Trump is leading on. I mean, look, who supports the war the most in this country? It's the MAGA Republicans. Everybody else is against this. Young people, America First people, Democrats, centrists. The only people in favor of this are the Trump cultists, generally over the age of 45. So unfortunately, those people, obviously, if Kamala Harris had dragged us into this war, would be against it. But because of Trump, we have this radical evangelical base of people that are ready to sacrifice their children for Israel. So that's the unfortunate reality of the situation. But you mentioned Pezeshkian and his strange statements. Thankfully, I think everyone can rest easy that Pezeshkian, I'd wager he might not even be top 10 in the real leadership ladder in Iran anymore. Obviously, at this point, he ranks well below the supreme leader himself. Larijani far outranked Pezeshkian in decision-making power. I would even wager that Commander Mohsen Razei and some of the other IRGC and Iranian army commanders have far more real power, both politically and militarily, than Pezeshkian. Of course, the three current members on the Executive Leadership Council that were leading the country and making all the decisions before the current supreme leader was elected, as well as, of course, the Assembly of Experts themselves that elected the supreme leader. I'd wager a lot of these people all have more real on-the-ground power than Pezeshkian. Even Abbas Araghchi himself might have more clout than Pezeshkian at this point. So that is the reality of the situation. Of course, Pezeshkian, Araghchi, and Larijani were all seen walking in the streets for Quds Day, for Martyrs' Day, for Jerusalem, which is all very relevant to this conflict. Of course, Al-Aqsa flood and the Quds forces are very relevant in Hamas and in the Palestinian resistance. So again, it all circles back to Hassan Nasrallah, Khamenei. All these people are, even though they're Lebanese, Iranian respectively, the resistance and the Palestinian cause, it's all formed together into one pure anti-Jewish, anti-Israel kind of cause. So that's why there are so many reasons to march in the streets in Iran. And it's crazy that millions of the people are still taking to the streets as airstrikes rain down near them. So it's very clear that the decapitation strikes against the Iranian leadership and the supreme leader has completely backfired. Mojtaba Khamenei is rumored to be far more intense and radical and eschatologically minded and, inclined towards the destruction of Israel than his father was. He has the most loyalty of the Basij and the IRGC of any leaders, which is why Trump has so vehemently rejected his leadership over the country. And this is from Anti-War, his first statement. Iran's new leader says Strait of Hormuz will remain closed and attacks on U.S. bases will continue. Ayatollah Mojtaba Khamenei, who replaced his slain father as the new supreme leader of Iran, issued his first statement on Thursday, where he said the Strait of Hormuz will remain closed and vowed Iranian attacks on U.S. bases in the region would continue. Certainly, the leverage of blocking the Strait of Hormuz must also continue to be used, Khamenei said in his message, which was issued as a written statement and read on Iranian TV. He suggested that Iran could open other fronts in the war and vowed there would be revenge for Iranians who have been killed, including the more than 100 girls and boys killed by a U.S. strike on an elementary school in the opening hours of the war, which, as Dmitry mentioned, his own wife was visiting the school at the time of that strike and was killed. He says the retaliation we have in mind is not only related to the martyrdom of the great leader of the revolution, rather every member of the nation who was killed by the enemy becomes a separate case in the file of retaliation, Khamenei said. Of course, a limited portion of this retaliation has already taken concrete form, but until it is fully realized, this file will remain open above the others. We will be especially sensitive regarding the blood of our children. Therefore, the crime the enemy deliberately committed against the Shajaret Tayyibeh school in Manab and certain similar cases holds a particular place in this process of accountability, he added. The Iranian leader addressed regional countries, saying that Iran wants good relations with its neighbors but would continue targeting U.S. bases as long as they remain. From now on, we will again be compelled to continue doing this if necessary, although we still believe in the importance of maintaining friendly relations with those neighboring countries, he said. Khamenei also addressed the killing of his father, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who ruled Iran from 1989 until he was hit by an Israeli strike on February 28th. Mojtaba Khamenei lost other family members in the attack, including his wife, mother, and sister, although I believe, as of now, his mother has been confirmed to actually be alive, so I guess that's a good thing. He says, "Leader, with your departure, you have inflicted a heavy grief upon the hearts of us all. You always longed for this end, and finally the Almighty granted it to you while you were reciting the Holy Quran on the morning of the 10th day of the blessed month of Ramadan," Khamenei said. So far, the younger Khamenei hasn't made any public appearances since he was named the new leader by Iran's Assembly of Experts. After he was appointed, massive rallies were held in Tehran and other major cities to show support for the new leader, one of the many signs that the U.S.-Israeli bombing campaign is not bringing about regime change. And frankly, what this is proving, and we will 100% learn this if Netanyahu really is dead as we're taken out in some capacity, which again, not reporting, not confirming here at all, but some of the evidence towards it is, for example, his son Yair Netanyahu, homosexual, regularly known for fleeing to Miami as things get hot in the Zionist entity. He used to tweet 20, 30, 40 times a day. In the past few days, he hasn't tweeted anything, so perhaps there was some very negative family news. Maybe the family compound got hit in some capacity. And the other main thing that has people speculating is Scott Bessent. He was doing an interview, I think it might have been with the BBC or maybe some other very mainstream outlet, of course. He was talking. He then got called away into the Situation Room. He might have been gone for up to 2 hours. I don't know exactly, but he returned. The journalist stayed to do the interview, and he was visibly shaken. He couldn't even finish the interview properly. He was at a loss for words. So maybe he had been informed of some kind of major strike to the point where he himself was even afraid for his life, having now become such a partisan supporter of this genocidal Jewish war. Of course, himself also a homosexual. So that, just throwing that out there so everybody is aware. But that is some of the evidence people are pointing to point out that Netanyahu may no longer be, at the very least, disposed to carry out his prime minister duties. I'm not sure what exactly would happen in the aftermath of that, if there would be some major, what happened in Iran was obviously the principalists gained more power. The IRGC has solidified control and has gotten their guy in there politically. Would the IDF get one of their guys in power? Would there be military alliances? Would Netanyahu's coalition put out an even farther, more Zionist person? Or would the Israeli opposition, who have been rallying against Netanyahu for years now, would they finally get Yair Lapid or one of these other people, Benny Gantz, back in power, and they would sort of be united around a just slightly more centrist, more domestically moderate, outward-facing Zionist Greater Israel project? Because as Yair Lapid said, there is no domestic opposition in this time of war. So fundamentally, all the Jews and all the politicians there are on the same team. But the military censorship in Israel is crazy. We have no idea the real amount of civilian casualties. At this point, it's definitely in the hundreds, I would wager, in Israel. Military casualties from high-ranking officers, we have no idea. And as you said, Dmitry, we've seen the major bunker busters in some capacity being used in Iran against the supreme leader, against others. We don't know how effective they've been. We've seen B-2s, B-1s, B-52s being used, of course, so I'm sure it's happening in some capacity, but undoubtedly the Iranian bunker busters are being used too. If that's happening from the West, why would we assume that not at least some of these strikes, which I've seen confirmed and I've seen real missile experts saying that some of these have been major bunker busting forces and munitions? Obviously, there's going to be some high-level Israeli targets that have been taken out. So, of course, it would be foolish to believe that anything else would be occurring. But one of the main things that has really fascinated me have been the strikes on Dubai. I don't know if I believe the reports that claim that more missiles and drones have struck the United Arab Emirates than Israel itself. Maybe. But one of the things that was hit today was, of course, the Dubai Tower, which is one of the major buildings in the Dubai skyline, one of the taller buildings, not as tall as Burj Khalifa, of course, but very tall, as well as the Dubai International Finance Center, were heavily struck by Iranian drones, which is fascinating because, of course, in our episode with George McMillan, before the war broke out, he discusses how fundamentally Israel, City of London, World Jewry, and their usurious finance system set up their base in the Islamic world in Dubai with the Dubai International Finance Center. That is where they basically exact usury and have spread the tentacles of the City of London Finance Center into the Islamic world, which otherwise, of course, Islamic banking bans usury. So Iran's sending a real message, I think, to world Jewry, hitting the Dubai International Finance Center. Of course, the Iranians have sent out pamphlets and sent out digital alerts calling on all members of Gulf countries to report on the location of U.S. troops who are largely staying in hotels in places like Bahrain, places like Baghdad, places like Kuwait, Qatar. A lot of these strikes on hotels have been Iranian targets on U.S. targets, CIA, U.S. soldiers themselves, and they're now calling on Gulf countries and these other citizens to report these locations to them, much like the Israelis are dropping pamphlets and sending things to other people in Iran and in Lebanon to work with them against axis of resistance forces and against the Iranian regime, of course, in Iran itself. But you mentioned the Iraq war and, of course, the similarities and how that turned into a disaster. And again, I think it's so funny that we're about to do this again after the Iraq war when literally Iraqi airspace and Iraq itself has not been secured. Iraq is one of the main theaters of conflict supporting Iran. There are ground battles between U.S. troops and Iraqi militias in Iraq right now. So there's, in certain capacities, more warfare going on in Iraq than Iran. The KC Stratotanker that was shot down by Iraqi forces. A lot of the strikes on Kuwait where people have died were done by Iraqi militants. So Iraq has been a complete failure. They're still our enemy. The Shias there are still fighting against us. And now we want to do it again in Iran. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And again, Erbil and the Kurdish situation, our bases there have faced some of the most intense strikes of all. We've pulled out a huge amount of people, but I think we're going to be up to 9,000 or 10,000 troops in the region once you add these 5,000 Marines with the 4,000 to 5,000 other troops. But before you maybe give us a few updates on the Russia-Ukraine situation, Dmitry, obviously there's updates on Ukrainian drones and other technical pieces of equipment being moved to the Middle East and the Gulf to defend against these Iranian drones. But on Trump's phone call with Putin recently, one of the things that has been claimed was that Trump rejected a Russian proposal to move Iranian enriched uranium to Russia itself. So maybe that will also harden the Russian resolve to simply support Iran in this conflict as it is ongoing there. But I mentioned, of course, the strikes on the Dubai National Finance Center and how the Emirates have been facing extreme amounts of strikes recently. This is having an effect on the Sudanese armed forces who have now been taking major victories against the rapid support forces who have been, again, genociding, looting their way with the support of Israel and the UAE across Sudan. They're now being depleted. The SAF, the junta in Sudan have pledged allegiance to Iran. So maybe if they're able to fully defeat the RSF, Sudan will then start launching strikes over Saudi Arabia, over the region with the Houthis, at Israel, at the other enemies of Iran in the region. That is very much a possibility. Of course, Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed, the leader there, recently met with Zayed in the UAE. So we still have Somaliland and Ethiopia as UAE Israeli allies in the region. So the surrounding of Saudi Arabia and the surrounding of the entire Arabian Peninsula by Israel and the UAE is still an attempted project that they are undergoing. But people are saying the UAE is over, with tourism and investment now going to be dwindling as these strikes go on, as they're being, reduced to ruin in a lot of ways and are now no longer considered a safe, neutral country in the region. It's clear that this is very much could be the end of the UAE's financial dominance, with Dubai as the center for international wealthy tourism. I think that very much might be in the past. And frankly, thank goodness, nobody couldn't have come sooner. But as other countries getting involved, we do have the Romanians pledging their bases to be used in strikes on Iran. So I don't know if we'll see Iranian missiles or strikes on Romania. Maybe the Russians would somehow escalate, but obviously that would be another Article 5 invocation, with Romania being a major NATO base host and a major NATO member. So between Turkey and Romania, we now have more and more NATO factions entering the fray officially. But of course, the Russia-Ukraine battle has not become as much of a focus recently. I don't know if the Russians are not advancing in particular. Again, we've speculated that, unlike what we wish was happening, where the Russians are taking the advantage of this to advance rapidly, it unfortunately seems that there seems to be a bit of I don't know if there's negotiations going on, or if there seems to be everybody sort of paused to then monitor the situation in the Middle East. But that does seem to be what is happening. But again, before I throw it over to you, if you want to talk about Russia-Ukraine, I know it's not the biggest news story this week. We did also have the major Iraqi militias and Iran strikes on Italian and French bases in the Middle East. Many French forces and Italian forces are being pulled out. I know it was in Erbil or in Iraq somewhere the Italian base was struck. All the soldiers are now being pulled away. The Charles de Gaulle French aircraft carrier is being deployed to the region. I don't know exactly where it is right now. I think it's either about to enter the Red Sea, or it's somewhere off the coast of Israel, or protecting Cyprus. I know is one of the main things the French deployed their forces to do. But the French Navy is very much entering the battle right now. So any comments on the French and Italian situation before we talk about Russia-Ukraine, Dmitry?
Yeah, I think it's very curious because France has been one of those countries, a member state of NATO, obviously huge navy, huge military capacity in terms of its power as a European country who's well and truly still part of the EU, one of the Masonic pillars of the European Union, you can say, economically speaking, alongside Germany. But unlike Germany, France well and truly still retains its sort of military dominance in terms of it has commandos, it has an air force, it has obviously the technology. The military industrial complex of France has only been strengthening since the Charles de Gaulle years. And obviously, France has an insane energy capacity in terms of it's one of the few European countries which has more or less self-sustaining as long as it can retain an influx and an importation of uranium from other places, given its nuclear reactor capacity. And in fact, it's well and truly fueling Germany as well as many other countries. As we mentioned earlier, France literally had free energy over the last few months, just over the winter of 2025, 2026. So it's quite interesting. But in any capacity, I think French interests in Iran have always been a little bit perhaps on the pro-Shia side. As we recall, one of the main countries that supported the Shah was always the British Empire, the UK, and they always fought with the Russian Empire for dominance between the mullahs and the Shah. There was always that tension there. But France kind of has always been on the other angle. It's always been helping Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, in a way, sometimes supporting Armenian interests as well. France has always been kind of on the outskirts of this entire conflict zone. And sometimes, obviously, the French Rothschild family had a huge interest in the Azeri Baku oil fields, even during the Russian imperial period, before they were kicked out by Alexander III, that is the Russian Tsar, father of Nicholas II. So it's really interesting how France at the moment is truly like choosing to pull out its troops out of Iraq when the war is only beginning to heat up, almost because, as we know, most likely France, out of all of the other European countries, which aren't obviously Russia or involved in the Ukrainian conflict, it's probably the most, I would say, neutral on the Iranian question. And yes, that may have something to do with France possibly playing a bit of a padlyanka, like a prank on the UK by supporting the first Ayatollah supreme leader, giving him a Air France ticket with a plane full of journalists and like dropping them into Iran in 1979 just to sort of twist a dagger in the back of the British Empire. And this could be like an internal, I think, Masonic dialogue that's going on here, Conrad. Clearly, it's similar to the Bolsheviks fighting amongst each other in the 1930s. Not to say that France, as we know from the words of Gabriel the Russian himself, France and its elites are well and truly deeply Masonic, all of them. To get anywhere in the positions of power in the French Navy, the military, or in politics, you need to be literally a member of a Masonic lodge or compromised in some way. As we know, even Jeffrey Epstein had some ties to French pedophilia circles and these other things. So I'm not saying France is a good country by any stretch, but it certainly has its own sovereign sort of personal interests, which I think could be exploited by Russia and its allies. As we know, Macron has postured a lot about the Ukrainian issue and has said that, look, French troops will be on the ground in Romania or Moldova and some of these other places, but he's never actually acted upon it. Whereas the UK, obviously the former British Empire, has in fact positioned troops in the Baltic states, has in fact fostered somebody like the former commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, the ambassador to the UK. The UK is more responsible, I would say, and even the whole Boris Johnson story is more responsible for the Ukrainian nonsense than France is. And France in some way is trying to maybe edge itself away from some of the huge World War III implications that are taking place. Potentially, maybe France sits this one out, the First World War that France will not participate in actively, maybe it can reap the benefits after everything, of course, falls apart around Europe. And look, France is one of those countries that some of the so-called advisors of Putin, and those with rabbinic ancestry, right? They've never said, like Solovьев Shapiro has never said, we're going to nuke Paris. He's always said, we're nuking Berlin and we're nuking London. So even the Russian spokespersons, those with Talmudic ancestry on Russian television, Russia 24 and Russia Channel 1, have never actually made any super angsty and aggressive anti-French statements. So it's curious. I think there is a layer of French neutrality that perhaps they are still holding a sort of balanced position. But let's not forget France did participate in the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier, participated in the destruction of Libya as well. So this is not a beast without fangs and claws. So France is still a very dangerous country and well and truly can still be involved in the Eastern Mediterranean, especially with those Franco-Lebanese interests. As we know, there's a lot of French cafes in Lebanon and Beirut, right? That cuisine is popular there. So France might be returning to its old colonial aspirations there, given its recent losses in the Sahel region. So it's all very complicated and interesting. But I did want to mention that the British presence, obviously, not just in the Eastern Mediterranean, which now Britain well and truly it's utilizing its airfields in the UK to house these B-52, 56-meter long wingspan bombers that are destroying the lives of Iranians and some of their military bases, but also the B-1 bombers, which look like the Blackbird X-Men, ships from the comic books. Britain is well and truly participating on the American and Israeli side actively now, even without the Prince of Wales aircraft carrier being in the Red Sea or actively, participating in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's not even that Britain is now, I think, in this coalition of Gulf states. And yeah, there may be like a Lawrence of Arabia angle here as well. Jay Dyer speaks a lot about this, how Britain was at the forefront of the Sykes-Picot division of the Middle East. There's no reason to, even though Britain internally is falling apart domestically, it still has these aggressive foreign political aspirations, and they shouldn't be ignored at all. And of course, the recent tragedy that took place in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, one of the biggest stories this week was the massive Storm Shadow attack on the Bryansk city. And out of the three regions which are not quite in the SMO zone, Belgorod, Kursk, Bryansk being closest to Chernigovskaya Oblast and Sumskaya Oblast, obviously in Belarus. So Bryansk is the region that is in that triangle zone between Chernigov, Belarus, and of course Russia, where of course all three countries intersect. The Bryansk city, which is much deeper inland than either Kursk city itself or Belgorod, was hit by Ukrainian Storm Shadows. And these Storm Shadow cruise missiles are shot. They're obviously GPS guided. The technology for Storm Shadow missiles was actually stolen by the British during the Gulf War in 1991, when it was the first time these sort of cruise missiles were used with GPS guided technology by the Americans. And the Storm Shadow was developed by, essentially stolen by British spies and used to develop this very powerful missile that can be fired from a plane from very, very far away, hundreds of kilometers away, to keep the pilots of the aircraft safe. So Ukrainian pilots most likely shot this missile out. Yes, with people, and the Russian, military has already announced there was British specialists who participated in this particular strike on Bryansk, which now, as of today, 14th of March, has resulted in the deaths of 8 Russian civilians in the city of Bryansk itself. But there's also been destruction, a huge destruction in the middle of Bryansk, over 50 buildings damaged, entire roads, highways taken out. Just in the center of the city, lots of vehicles were destroyed. And the injuries are numbering between 50 and 100 people. So this was labeled by the Russians as a terror strike. But again, questions, Conrad, as to, look, if the British participated in a strike against Russian civilians, what's the answer here? What are the Russians going to do? Like, how do you respond to British collaboration in a terror strike against the Russian civilians? And you have to ask the question. Alexander Bortnikov, the head of the FSB, last year, he confirmed ISIS Khorasan were behind the Crocus City Hall attacks. And just this week, he said ISIS Khorasan worked with the UK, with MI6. So now again, we have this British sled, so to speak, the British red knot that you can sort of trace and find British collaboration with Ukrainians, with ISIS, fighting against the Russians, killing Russian civilians in these various terror strikes. And you have to raise the question, when is there going to be any sort of retribution? When is there going to be an answer? Or is Russia going to actually assist Iran in striking against some of these British colonial bases in Cyprus or these other places? Or is Russia just going to accept the fact that the UK is literally fighting an active proxy war against it, and simply not answer directly? And one of the tweets I posted recently is, sadly, because the Russian capitalist sort of interests have been so integrated with the UK. Shapiro Solovyov, for example, owns a mansion in the UK. It's probably frozen right now because of the sanctions, but Russian oligarchs have been living in London. They've been sending their children to all these British universities and English schools. They've been purchasing English real estate for so long in these major cities. And they've been, of course, even Abramovich, he was the owner of that soccer team in England. Like, all this integration between the two countries, it's really, I think, damaged the Russian capacity to even make decisions. And by Russians, I mean the elites of Russian society just do not see it in themselves to even reply properly to some of these egregious strikes against the literally Russian civilians. So it's quite detrimental, I think, to morale in Russia. And yes, most likely there'll be even more dead from those strikes upon Bryansk. Storm Shadow missiles are incredibly powerful. They've only been used several times. And, the Ukrainians themselves, Zelensky has announced that he's developing, alongside the Ukrainian military specialists, they're developing ballistic missiles to be used with Ukraine. So not only do we have I believe it's the FP9 Flamingo missile that has recently, on the 20th of February, flown 800 kilometers. So the Ukrainians shot 6 Flamingo FP9 missiles. They flew 800 kilometers and hit targets deep inside of Russian territory, way past the SMO zone. Now Ukraine is developing its own Tomahawk missiles, basically. That's what the announcement is. And it's like question marks as to how this is even possible, why these facilities shouldn't just be taken out in preliminary strikes. And at the moment, the reason on the front lines, Conrad, things aren't moving as smoothly as they were before is because Now the winter snow is thawing, it's melting. It's basically what's called the spring mud season, as we're sort of in the middle of March. Trucks, vehicles, it's very difficult to get through these fields. There is slight Ukrainian progression, specifically in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, like they are trying to take back certain villages, and in the Gulai Polya around that small, sort of very ancient Cossack city. So in the plain territories, just to the west of the Donetsk People's Republic, there is some movement by Ukraine. They're trying to push back the Russians. But in terms of the city conflicts, especially in Zaporozhye, in Konstantinovka, and in Kupiansk, the Russians are holding strong. I just want to mention it's a crazy announcement, but I mean, the Russian commander Gerasimov did tell us 3 weeks ago that Kupiansk-Uzlovoy was taken, and Kupiansk-Uzlovoy is not fallen yet. So the Ukrainians are still there. They're still, mingling among the buildings. They're still defending it. They're still sort of fighting the Russians back. So it's still, urban warfare is well and truly ongoing in Kupiansk, and Kupiansk is one of the major cities that still hasn't fallen in the Kharkivskaya Oblast. All this fighting seems very monotonous, and in fact, I think for the Russians, it's become even more difficult ever since the disconnection of Starlink. On the positive side, though, the Russian main internet agency for the government has announced that Telegram will no longer be slowed or blocked in the SMO zone. So in fact, when you travel to the front lines, Russian Telegram usage will be completely open, untampered with, and that's positive because Telegram, via its more or less safe encryption, is being used as one of the main ways the Russians can actually contact their loved ones and to hold up those, personal relationships with family members and other people back home, because Russia's a large place. Obviously, you need good internet connection, but specifically in the SMO zone, as you yourself, Conrad, have confirmed on your recent visits, internet connection is not always guaranteed everywhere. So the loss of Starlink is, I think, like a huge blow to both sides in the war, at least in terms of making rapid progression forward. In any case, there's pretty much just the weird silence coming in from the Russian side in terms of there hasn't been that many drone bombardments by the Russians of Ukrainian territory over the last week. Some people have speculated that potentially that's because the Russians are actually sending their drones elsewhere, not that they have drone capacity online, and it matches that of the Ukrainians. Maybe the Russians are in fact sending their drones to Iran via the Caspian or dropping them off in some of those northeastern airports with those Ilyushin planes. Who knows? Maybe the Russians are actually supplying the Iranians with some of those drones, and that explains the lessening degree of drone strikes against Ukrainian targets over the last 7 to 8 days. I mean, that's an interesting hypothesis. I think potentially there could be some truth to it. And, we'll just see how this sort of conflict develops. But, I mean, it looks very strange, Conrad, as I'll mention in the next few moments, that Russian airfield bases, the Russians have 2 airport bases which have, Russian planes located on them. They've run sorties against their enemies before. That's one located in Armenia in the base of Gyumri, and 750 kilometers to the southwest is the Russian base in Lataki Khmimim. So we have these sort of Russian gates, which leave Syria, Turkey wide open. And these are essentially the aerial gates between these 2 Russian air bases. The Americans are flying these long-range European bombing B-52, B-1 bombing raids across all of Europe, flying between these 2 Russian air bases to attack Russia's ally, Iran. It looks very weird, I think, given the location of the Russian bases. And I think it just shows exactly what we spoke about since December 2024. As soon as Syria fell, the Bashar al-Assad regime fell, it really literally left Iran open, and it removed all of Russia's leverage from that East Mediterranean sort of Syria, Iraq, Middle Eastern region. Now it's basically Iran's game to play, with Russia sitting out and, if anything, only supplying Iran with military equipment and hardware via some of the Caspian Sea shipments, or perhaps aerial Ilyushin shipments, which is quite sad that it's kind of come down to this point. But this shows you how important that Syrian civil war is. And if we read history books, this will be like the prototypical build-up towards World War III. We will literally view the Syrian civil war as something that impacts literally world history, not just the fate of the Syrian people in and of themselves. So very interesting. And of course, there are calls for China to continue to supply Iran with military equipment, which China outproduces many countries. Probably the only country it wouldn't outproduce militarily is the United States. It's one of the few nations that can actually continue to bolster up Iran's military, whilst the US are running these massive raids upon the Iranian missiles and raining down Hellfire missiles via the MQ-9 Reaper drones from the air. China's somewhat a country that can continue to support Iran, despite the fact that allegedly Iran's not asking for help. But I think at this point, we're kind of past that point. You have to involuntarily almost bolster the nation just to protect your own interests. And that's why I think in the near future, even despite what Hezbollah or the Houthis do, there will be a huge aggression against Chinese interests via that hostage taking of Karg Island. I think it'll be very interesting how the Russians respond to it. And obviously the telephone calls between Trump and Putin, Conrad, they point towards Trump's very hawkish nature. Now at this point, he's not meddling with Putin anymore. That spirit of anchorage, what they used to call when Trump met with Putin in Alaska, and he showed this B-2 Spirit bombers flying overhead, and Trump points to it and he kind of smirks, and Putin looks up surprised, because they make a lot of noise. All of that power show was there for a reason. Trump is trying to essentially out-muscle Putin. It's almost like a bodybuilding show, and it's trying to essentially mog him, out-angle him, trying to show that, look, President Putin, we don't need your diplomatic support in the Middle East. We need you to finish up the silly war in Ukraine and then to submit and no longer support Iran. And the US is trying to apply as much pressure as possible to Russia. And what's interesting, people like John Bolton from the previous Trump administration, he basically said that it's actually a mistake to loosen these sanctions on Russian oil. So John Bolton was against that. Meanwhile, we have interesting other figures from American, you would say, military, like the hawkish side. Eric Prince, right, the former head of Blackwater in Iraq. The Academy was his new military sort of mercenary company. Eric Prince, who lived in Dubai and Abu Dhabi for a long time recently, has supported the Emirati Navy, actually, and some of these other commando forces there. He's come out and he said the entire war against Iran is actually a huge mistake. So Eric Prince is coming out as a dove in this conflict, which I would have thought Eric Prince would have supported the Trumps and Netanyahu war. But look, the head of Blackwater has already kind of realized how fruitless it would be to sort of attack this massive 90 million plus country, which has been preparing for a conflict for decades on end. So yeah, there's some really unexpected opinions of all these other massive spokespersons who have in one way or another contributed to what we see today as the Middle Eastern situation. So it'll be very curious, Conrad, to see where all of the sort of chips fall. But I think most of us are watching the Lebanese theater south of the Litani River, which the Israelis are looking to essentially genocide the Lebanese population. Let's just call it what it is. The Israelis are looking to turn the south of the Litani River, Lebanon, into a new Gaza, and then they're looking potentially to even settle it just like the West Bank. So they're going to use the dual strategy. Some of the Israeli hyper-Zionist spokespersons have already said that on air. They're going to physically try to remove the forces of Hezbollah. The war in Lebanon is only just beginning. It's literally in another front of this world war. It's only heating up. And of course, the other theater we're watching very closely is the Red Sea, the Gerald R Ford, and the Houthis. Exactly what will be the response there? Will the Gerald R Ford go home, or is it waiting for the Houthi missiles to fly at the American bases and at Israel? And then, of course, it's going to stand its ground alongside its 3 destroyers and the refueler craft. And they're going to try to shoot down as many of those Houthi missiles as possible, and maybe even fly sorties over Yemen and kill more innocent people as well as Ansar Allah fighters. So yeah, the Middle East is well and truly on fire at the moment, and the air is full of drones, ballistic missiles flying, and refueler planes. It's a real war zone at the moment.
No, it really is. The entire region. I should have done some research before the show. I don't even know how people are getting to the region. Are people flying into Dubai? Are people flying into Doha? Are people flying into Kuwait? I don't know how these planes are able to operate safely. It's really, again, it's already a regional war. And again, there are certain times, potentially even, especially in the First, if not the Second World War as well, where definitely before the Eastern Theater erupted, where there might not have been as many artillery projectiles flying at once as we're seeing in the midst of this war. And of course, drones obviously have not completely changed everything, but you talk about how everything is on fire. As we were recording this episode, of course, an Iranian missile struck the air defense system and the radar system on top of the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. So the degradation of America's radar capabilities continues. The ability for them to detect these strikes has been completely dismantled. And as many people have discussed, analysts have discussed, the destruction of the things in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. This really was the destruction of the first warning system of Israel's extensive air defense Iron Dome system. The reason they're able to get these alerts, the reason David Sling, Iron Dome, THAAD, Patriot systems that are all interconnected in Israel's air defense systems are able to operate so effectively is because they have these early warnings from the Gulf, from Iraq, from Jordan, that then allow the ones within Israel to operate. So Iran is highly degrading these capabilities. And it isn't just missiles and drones and jets in the sky. Actually, Israel has been spraying herbicides the southern Syrian countryside as they prepare to annex and take this territory, as they want to drive, I believe, many non-Druze, especially people out. I'm sure they're going to be replicating these same tactics in Lebanon as they prepare to advance and annex the territory south of the Litani River. These observations, the herbicide spraying, was confirmed by French observers And again, as you mentioned, Dmitry, the battle for Hezbollah is about to be intense. I think the Israelis are really trying to convince the Americans to continue to keep the pressure on Iran so that they can focus on Lebanon, while the Americans, of course, handle the Iranians and potentially the Houthis as well, and the Iraqis. At this point, America is really doing so much for Israel. It's starting to get out of hand. And now at this point, it is coming home to roost. And again, between false flags and legitimate anger at the war, there's so much to dissect with all of this. But one of the main attacks here was this attack in Michigan by Ayman Ghazali, the alleged Michigan synagogue shooter. He attacked Temple Israel, West Bloomfield Township, Michigan. Of course, only one person was killed, and it was a security guard. He himself was also neutralized. He himself, born 1985 in Lebanon, moved to America in 2011. Multiple family members of his, cousins and others, nieces and nephews, were killed in Israeli airstrikes on Lebanon. 2 of them at least were young children. And this apparently, I guess, was his justification for attacking this synagogue in America. Of course, we had this other attack on a synagogue center in New Jersey. Of course, the massive police response when this goes down is crazy. Much more police response to these synagogue attacks than there ever are for school shootings and others. So it shows you, the monopoly on violence resting with the police in America. Who do they really respond for? Of course, it is their Jewish overlords. But this person, more on the sleeper cell variety, is a person who at one point had pledged allegiance to ISIS and was on all sorts of terror watch lists. And I don't think they were able to kill anybody either. They were attempting to shoot up Old Dominion University, I believe, and there was a synagogue nearby. But I think maybe someone got injured, but a security response quickly neutralized them as well. So we're starting to see the activation of, whether it's just angry domestic Muslims or sleeper cells or any sorts of other things. I think one of the main things that would see the American war effort escalate beyond just limited ground operations on places like Karg Island and, of course, the airstrikes to something more akin to like hundreds of thousands of troops surging into Iran would be, of course, a major terrorist attack in the American homeland in Western Europe. Again, I speculated on attacks happening in Turkey. I'm sure we might see more things happen in Israel. The West Bank, I think, is waiting to be a new theater of conflict. So there's all sorts of things that we are waiting on. But I guess with all of that in mind, Dmitry, when do you expect to see the Houthis enter this conflict? How do you expect the ground operation into Lebanon to really go? Do you think that the Radwan forces will continue their victory streak of major ground victories? It seems, as far as I can tell, many people are saying that the Hezbollah ground forces are some of the most elite ground forces that currently exist, and what they've done against Israel really is quite impressive. And also, Dmitry, do you believe that the Syrian al-Jalani government will be supporting Israel in that operation? Because it wouldn't surprise me. They already have done so much for Israel that it wouldn't surprise me. And the Ummah, I guess, at that point would really just officially be behind Israel, because between them and the Gulf states, it really would just be the Ottoman Turks and the Persian Iranians somewhat standing against them. But then you'd ironically have the Shia bridge between the two still being a major Israeli ally. So anybody still supporting this Islamic unity idea, like Professor Zhang, I think is off their rocker. That's not to say there might not be some Shia unity. I mean, I've heard rumors that the Bahraini government may actually be on the brink, the illegitimate Sunni Khalifa regime. But I'd really love your thoughts on the potential for the Syrian government to intervene, and really, I guess, all these other thoughts in the Muslim world.
Yeah, I think the Syrian regime very much still depends on some key decision makers in the region, specifically Erdogan, right? Erdogan is the one who helped build this HTS, the Syrian rebel force in Idlib province. They were using the Turkish lira. Many of the so-called Syrian rebels are actually dressed in military Turkish uniforms. They were trained by Turkish elite commanders, officers, preparing for what we saw during the onslaught of December 2024. So in large part, as much as the regime in Damascus at the moment is very much controlled by countries like Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, they're funded by the Gulf states, by the Wahhabi Salafis. They're also very much dependent, I think, militarily speaking, on their masters, the Turks, which is why obviously they took all those territories from the Kurds. I mean, who does that benefit the most? Obviously, Erdogan and the Turkish military elite that probably support him and have supported him since the 2016 coup attempt. Obviously, these are not this is not the liberal, so to speak, very hyper-American Erdogan opposition. But at the moment, I think Erdogan does have a bit of a leash on the Damascus government, and most likely the same sort of leash he has on President Aliyev of Azerbaijan. So very well and truly, I think if we see Azerbaijan step into any sort of conflict against Iran, I think we'll see a simultaneous almost, and yeah, this is just my hypothetical prediction for the future, based on what we've been looking at and reading, there should be no problem for the Syrian government to actually step in south of the Litani River in a conjoined action alongside the Israelis, bring peace to the territory of southern Lebanon, and yes, maybe even with the sanction of the official Lebanese government. So it may be a three-pronged, so to speak, strike against Hezbollah in order to take them out. And keep in mind, there is still the USS Georgia, the nuclear American submarine stationed in the Eastern Mediterranean with, last reported, 154 Tomahawk missiles on board, Tomahawk cruise missiles. So that is an insanely packed to the rafters submarine there, which can most likely use those Tomahawk missiles against which targets? Well, maybe some sort of defensive positions of Hezbollah in that southern Lebanese region. So it's hard to envy the Lebanese at the moment as they try to defend their own sovereignty, specifically the Shia Hezbollah Lebanese who've been essentially uplifting and keeping the southern Lebanon region alive because from what I've heard from Lebanese spokespersons online, southern Lebanon has suffered so greatly over the last few decades because of the Israeli aggression that there's been less and less international, even local investment in the regions. Hezbollah has kept southern Lebanon really functioning. They have their own credit union system. They run the various shops there. They try to keep the region more or less functioning. They're giving people jobs. They're almost like a local militia. It's almost like a breakaway state in and of itself because the Lebanese government well and truly is subjugated to foreign powers, specifically, the Shabbos Goy masters in Tel Aviv and West Jerusalem. And I do feel that as soon as Erdogan is requested, we know Turkey is not really like a straightforward enemy of Israel. I think Erdogan is walking the finest line possible here in this conflict. And I think as soon as the decision is given, and who has really sway over Erdogan, it's hard to say who can convince him or pressure him. I don't think it would be Donald J. Trump. I think there's probably a combination of factors that need to be entered in. Remember, Erdogan never really swayed into the Ukrainians' side against Russia. Russia is building a nuclear reactor in the Mersin province, which is, of course, the Mersin province is located just to the west of the Adana province, which is where the Incirlik base is located. That's apparently where the US shot down the Iranian ballistic missile over Incirlik, which is where you have over 50 nuclear bombs located. So American nuclear bombs, literally from the Cold War era, preparing for mutual destruction, stationed in the Adana province close to Mersin. Mersin has a Russian nuclear reactor being constructed, a nuclear power plant to give the Turks energy. And of course, just to the east of that, to the southeast, you have the Antakya Antioch province, which is adjacent to Idlib. So all these territories, and just off the coast, you'd have, Turkish Cyprus. It's all a huge conglomeration of multinational interests. And I think Erdogan, well and truly, is one of those factors. His country is between the two major warring zones, the Middle East and Eastern Europe. And he really hasn't taken a position yet. Although he has, of course, heavily benefited the side of Israel and Ukraine, he hasn't really jumped ship and jumped across one particular barricade and joined a particular side in the trenches. But if he does, you can expect a Damascus HTS Wahhabi Salafi government to, I think, go into southern Lebanon with the blessing of Joseph Aoun. As weird as that sounds, like you'd think a Maronite president will be blessing Wahhabi Salafis. I think we've seen weirder than that in recent years, so let's not be too surprised.
I have people named Maronite Salafi replying to my posts on Twitter, unironically. So,
and there it is. Yeah.
Which is crazy because historically it was Syria, the Assad government, the SSNP working with Hezbollah and the Shia, and often the Orthodox against the Sunni and the Maronites in Lebanon in the past. And they were always like, oh, the Syrians invaded us. Oh, the Shia are Iranian Syrian invaders. But look at it now, of course, how the turns tables.
Yeah, it's completely insane. And yes, absolutely. We have seen a huge stand down as well, I would say, between the Armenian and Azeris. So Pashinyan has completely tapped out. Yes, there are Armenian elections coming up this year, and there's a chance Pashinyan will lose. But at the moment, he's basically said, no, we aren't looking to take the Nagorno-Karabakh back, but we're not interested in that at all. We're looking for a peaceful coexistence. I think the Armenian spirit has been entirely subdued, which, with all due respect, you just have to listen to our recent episode about Julian the Apostate to sort of understand. Unfortunately, the Armenians, they haven't had the longest history of state national sovereignty out of most countries. They've had maybe a few centuries in the last couple, if not 3 millennia. So sadly, I think the Armenian spirit has been broken by the Azeris. And I did mention this actually on X Space recently as well. The Azeris do have one of the most battle-hardened armies in that sort of Middle East and Caucasus region. They have actually actively participated in military operations, tactically and strategically speaking, against the Armenians. Yes, in a very small theater, albeit, but they do have military training. So we should really expect, if Erdogan does, green light the operation, we may see Damascus heading into southern Lebanon. We may see, of course, the Kurds, of course, with the blessing of the Americans, Israelis, heading into Iran, and maybe Azeri actions against Iran. And sadly, you just have to listen to some of our former episodes from 2025. The Russo-Azeri relationship has just been so complicated because we've had on one hand the Russian patriots, obviously very critical of Azeri, because the Azeri mountain Jewish clans in Moscow, they control most of the supermarkets. Crocus City Hall, for example, 15 conspirators and terrorists have been sentenced to life imprisonment actually this week, coincidentally. But the Crocus City Hall was owned by essentially this mountain Jewish Azeri clan of businessmen. Most supermarkets across major Russian million-person cities are owned by Azeris and mountain Jews, who, of course, are from Baku, are from those Caucasus regions. The Azeris have a huge oligarchic clan inside of Russia. And it's just very interesting to see if Russia will actually respond to any sort of Azeri aggression against Iran because, well, if you, for example, see Azeris as your enemies, can you imagine the internal pogroms and, I mean, the particular events you'd need to embark upon inside of Russia, domestically speaking, to subdue the toxic influence of Azeri and I would just say this weird mountain Talmudic influence inside of the country? I mean, the speculation we can kind of dwell upon here is quite broad. And last thing I'd like to mention is obviously the sort of NATO octopus is ever sort of moving. Its tentacles are everywhere. And in the Bessarabia region on the west coast of the Black Sea, we do have movements. Obviously, as you mentioned earlier, Conrad, Romania is now well and truly working with Ukraine. They've signed a sort of bilateral defense collaboration treaty. They've also signed an energy treaty. So now apparently Romania will be supplying energy in the near future to Ukraine if Slovakia and Hungary over the next 2 weeks disconnect themselves from providing Ukraine any of this energy due to Zelensky's gas manipulations with Slovakia, and Viktor Orban's not happy about that at all with Hungary, of course. So Romania is well and truly playing the role of the huge, like Eastern European Shabaskoy. And then you have to the south, you have Bulgaria, which is the Greeks have moved several Patriot missile systems to Bulgarian territory. My idea is most likely they've set those Patriot systems in Bulgaria to defend Bulgaria, like just listen to this, defend Bulgaria against the Iranian drones and ballistic missile systems. Excuse me? I mean, I don't think an Iranian drone has ever reached even up to like just through half of Turkey, let alone as far as Istanbul or Bulgaria. It's completely bogus. Most likely the Greeks are just, posturing themselves amidst the recent events in the Eastern Mediterranean and Cyprus. Maybe they're preparing for what eventually will take place between Greece and Turkey, according to the Orthodox Christian prophecies, but also potentially they're trying to defend one of the major Greek port cities just south of Bulgaria in that East Macedonia, Thrace region called Alexandropolis, basically. So, which is the largest Greek city close to Istanbul. So those Patriot missile systems, although they are on Bulgarian territory, they are defending, of course, a major Greek port city. So big movements happening in sort of Eastern Europe, and you have Moldova officially declaring that it will be leaving the CIS, SNG, Commonwealth of Independent States. That is that union that sort of existed since the Belovezhskaya Push in 1991 when the USSR fell apart. Most of the countries joined the CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States Union, which was mainly, defense / networking / economic unity. It's well and truly a very watered down version of the EU. But Moldova has already announced, and this is, of course, throwback to last year's Moldovan elections, which I think was stolen well and truly. One of those impacts, Moldova is now coming more to the Romanian axis and joining more of the EU, distancing itself from Orthodox Christian Russia. And who knows what implications this will have for Pridnestrovia, Transnistria. And so the Russians have multiple theaters to be looking at here. And somehow all of this is tied together with, countries like Turkey, Iran, Israel. It's all incredibly concerning. There are so many Gordian knots that will need to be cut if the situation is to be resolved properly without excessive bloodshed and a giant humanitarian crisis, which at the moment is facing Iran as well as the United Arab Emirates. I mean, these are two countries which are being hit in such intensity. And we know Israel will probably never have a humanitarian crisis, Conrad, because the entire world there'll be a fleet of probably not Greta Thunberg, but there will be an entire Talmudic fleet full of goods and services arriving down the Eastern Mediterranean to save the poor people from another potential Shoah, which, may be imposed upon them by the patriotic Iranians and Hezbollah if anything bad was to happen to the poor Israeli people.
Now, again, whether it's Patagonia, Argentina, New Heavenly Jerusalem in Ukraine, the Russian Oblast out there, maybe somewhere in Asia is being prepared. I'm sure the Jews have their contingency plans. And if not, well, then the Samson option is always there, of
Hmm.
course. And people say that, I'll be like, how will Israel be able to launch all the nukes out of their tiny territory? Their nukes are elsewhere. They have nukes in offshore bases or even in potential submarines in random parts of the world. It would be a fully extensive operation. I mean, look what happened with the pagers. You think they don't have much larger contingency plans worked out than that? But of course, we do have some church news I want to get into, Dmitry. But I guess before we dive into that, if you have any final thoughts on the Middle Eastern situation, on the potential for these U.S. troops to be involved, on when the Houthis are going to join the battle, feel free to let me know your thoughts on all of that. I do think ultimately we're going to be in for a long slog here. At the very least, this war is going to extend through the summer. And I'm mostly just curious about how and when exactly it's going to connect with the Russians and that land bridge of conflict, through the Turks and through Syria. I think maybe Lebanon might be what activates some of that as well. So we're going to be watching all of that very closely. But before we do church news, and you can transition to that yourself if you feel like it, any final thoughts on the war itself, World War III?
Yeah, I think looking at the situation, no doubt the 31st Marine Expeditionary Fleet, and I feel very sorry for those 5,000 American personnel, 2,200 Marines who will be dispatched onto either Karg Island or, God forbid, somewhere near the Straits of Hormuz, because 5,000 people will not be able to hold even Keshem Island, right, in the Straits of Hormuz. It's simply too large a landmass, and its population is between 150 and 200,000 people. So there are, imagine 200,000 Iranians who are very upset at you, and you're only a group of 5,000. How can you really hold realistically this landmass? Even if you destroy the desalination plants and try to force a lot of the native population of the Iranians to abandon their homes, still there's going to be huge guerrilla warfare possibilities for the Americans. And we knew what happened in Afghanistan and all the unnecessary losses that our European American brothers suffered because of all those huge unnecessary expeditions in the Middle East in the past. But it's just very concerning. I think the operation of Karg Island, I think the impact that will have on China in order to rein the Chinese in and to control them in terms of economic subversion is a huge possibility. Karg Island, I think, is one of those targets. Most likely there will be support from the UAE, which is very upset at Iran right now, potentially even Qatar. You'll have Bahrain, maybe Kuwait collaborating in this massive drop-off on the Karg Island. I think there may be an expeditionary launch there, but it will take some time because the 31st Marine Expeditionary Fleet, from what we understand, is at the moment just leaving Asia now. So it will take them at least a week to get to the Sea of Arabia and the Persian Gulf. And, will they be crossing the Straits of Hormuz? And again, big question, right? And how will they be protected? I mean, the Americans really need to begin taking out Iranian capacity to actually destroy these ships in the Straits of Hormuz over the next 7 days. And I mean, that's a huge bar to set for the American Air Force. And, we'll see where all of that goes. But also the 82nd Airborne Division, over 50 to 60,000 American airborne paratrooper commandos, that can be naturally, a force of that size can be utilized to secure some of those Bandar Abbas or Keshem Island locations, even Hormuz Island, to, of course, make sure that the shipping lanes are clear. It is very, I think, disgusting optically, Conrad, and there's nothing, of course, spiritual about this. The fact that Trump is now saying, in order to restore the world capitalistic, Talmudic, commercial economy, we need to spill American blood. I mean, it's almost as if almost as if the Marxist conclusions about the world being run by powerful elite capitalists is almost true. But we do understand they have non-monetary considerations behind the scenes, which is why Marxism is wrong. It's not materialism that drives these people. It's very dark spiritual considerations, which I think they're probably acting upon now. And I think just transitioning to church news, I think most likely you'll see these implications being flown about in Ukraine when the Ukrainians end up losing major cities. Their morale will begin dropping. Persecution of the church will be escalating more and more. As we saw recently, there has been another church has been taken over in the Chernovitskaya diocese in western Ukraine. Specifically, it was a Father Roman of the OCU. Actually, he gave an interesting video clip. He said, so we've taken over this church. The local Orthodox Christians, the Onufriotes, as they call them, he says they gave this church to us without any struggle. They just gave us the keys. But he said they took the icons of many of the Russian saints, and he gives a list. He says St. Matrona of Moscow, St. Seraphim of Sarov. He mentions St. Sergius of Radonezh, and he's like, that's okay. Look, we don't really venerate these Russian saints anyway, which is like completely preposterous. So it's like, hello? So even though St. Seraphim of Sarov became a monk in what's now known as the territory of Ukraine, by the way, during a pilgrimage to Kiev, if I'm not mistaken. So it's just so bizarre, like this priest just positioning himself and taking over this Dormition Cathedral, and it's just a real shame. So there have been more church takeovers. There's been one of the most negative characters in the Ukrainian church scene. This is a guy who essentially runs the OCU militia, a Ukrainian crusader. He calls himself Dmitry Karchinsky. We've mentioned him a few times before. He's almost like the antithesis of Igor Strelkov. If Igor Strelkov was protecting Orthodoxy in the Ukraine and the Donbass during his tenure there as the defense minister, this Dmitry Karchinsky character has been persecuting Christianity. He turned one of the church halls in the Kiev-Pechersk Lava into his own like militarized propaganda base. One of his symbols is like a red labarum of St. Constantine the Great, which he sort of self-imposes upon his soldiers, even though I'm not even sure if they take communion or go to confession or anything like that. He's kind of trying to LARP as this Ukrainian patriotic Christian paladin. He gave a recent speech essentially stating that the more Ukraine becomes like Europe, so the more Europeanized Ukraine becomes, the closer to Christ it will get. So he says, Christ can only be truly known through European culture, and we, Ukraine, are the vanguard of European civilization against the hordes of the East. And it's like weird, like, I mean, there's no citations of saints, nothing. It's just this Korchinsky guy, his interpretation. And by the way, his militias were responsible for most of those violent attacks you've seen in the footages against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the last few years since the beginning of the war. Like, it's Dmitry Korchinsky. He's one of the most preposterous. He has a Wikipedia page, but this guy's like a militant OCU, militant schismatic, is one of the most satanic characters active right now. And he even has this like weird fake sort of Cossack mustache and everything. So he's playing the real role of like a Mazeppa, a Judas character. And sadly, that's exactly what's happening in Ukraine right now. Not many news besides that, but we understand, Metropolitan Arsenius of Svyatogorsk Monastery is free at the moment, but I don't believe he's allowed to go back to his monastery because his monastery right now, the Russians are located 3 kilometers away from the Svyatogorsk National Park. They're very, very close. I think the monks in the Svyatogorsk Monastery can probably hear artillery fire and all of that. So we have to keep all of the monastics in that largest monastery in East Ukraine in our prayers because they may be facing a Russian liberation and everything that comes with that, which includes maybe Ukrainian demoralization tactics and all kinds of excesses. Sadly, I think we know that when the Ukrainians retreat from a certain territory, we saw this in the Kursk Oblast, and Conrad heard it firsthand from some of the Russian commandos in the St. Alexander Nevsky Brigade and Battalion. When the Ukrainians leave a certain territory, they try to desecrate and try to, assault the innocent people as much as possible so that, of course, the Russians, when they come in, liberate the town, the church, the monastery, they have to clean things up and fix broken things. And of course, they come towards a site of, unkept territories and all kinds of desolate scenes, which then they have to kind of contend with and fix. So it creates more problems for the Russians. So again, this is not a Christian tactic. It's a scorched earth tactic in a sense, used by ancient armies, but used against Christian holy sites, which is just as disgusting as it sounds. So there's a few more church stories this week, Conrad, but from the Ukrainian side, at the moment, it's been quite a fairly quiet week, and I think probably because the Ukrainians are still recovering, at least on a governmental level, and they're still recovering from an insanely negative winter where many cities like Odessa, Lvov, Kharkov, and even Kyiv itself, the capital, they've had no power. So I think just generally speaking, even the Ukrainian soldiers who are actively persecuting the church, those militiamen, they're probably heavily demoralized. And I think the Ukrainians themselves, they've really suffered throughout December to February. Not that that's a good thing for, of course, the regular innocent people, but I think even the persecutors of Christianity have had a very difficult time over the last 3 months.
No, it's true. I mean, they've been focused on a bit of a different struggle. And again, I'm no ecumenist. I don't believe the Muslims even worship the same God as Christians. But Zog, the Zionist entity, the forces of evil across the world, I think have been confronted with a valiant and brave, for better or for worse, very deeply religious Iranian people that are willing to die for what they believe in. And Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, most of the American soldiers being deployed, frankly, aren't really willing to die for their cause. Meanwhile, the average Iranian does seem willing. I mean, I saw literally a video of a young Iranian soldier who was, just outside of his base somewhere filming a video saying, I was able to get access to call my family, and my father insisted. He's like, doesn't matter what happens if all your comrades die. Apparently his son had just recounted how we lost many of our soldiers and we lost many of our brothers in strikes recently. And he said, you will not come home and not surrender. You need to serve out your time, even if you are a martyr. If you come back here, I don't want anything to do with you. So the Iranian society is radicalized and mobilized, and that is the reality that's being faced. But as far as the forces of darkness, many of these forces of darkness that persecute the church unfortunately exist within the church. And the Union of Orthodox Journalists recently leaked a letter that El Pideforos sent to Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople. It was dated November 21st, 2025. It was mostly focused on counter-signaling and trying to paint the Society of St. John and the Day of Action that the pro-UOJ, Ukrainian UOC, Ukrainian Orthodox Church activists in America have been performing. One of the most interesting sections of this, of course, is how El Pideforos, he calls the OCA the so-called OCA, very much showing how the EP and Goarts do not recognize the Orthodox Church in America's autocephaly. He also calls Metropolitan Onufri Mr. Onufri. So, of course, they don't recognize his episcopacy at all. And in general, it's just very disrespectful towards many bishops, many priests, many people across the jurisdiction. That's very negative towards the UOJ itself. Obviously, it talks negatively about the activists that went there, and it is attempting to, and basically uses Alex Karloutzos and the other EP Goarch's influence to sabotage potential meetings between these lawmakers and these church officials. So very, very disgusting, subversive, anti-church behavior coming out of El Pideforos. Of course, the parishioners and the Brotherhood at St. Nicholas Monastery in Miltsy province in Volyn, Ukraine, have appealed to these same people, like Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna and other U.S. officials that are sympathetic to the UOJ as they are being persecuted by the local authorities. It says here, the appeal published on Telegram channel Kozak TV comes as the monastery faces potential eviction following the expiration of its lease agreement with the state. According to the abbot, Archimandrite Leonti, the community rebuilt monastic life at the site after the fall of the Soviet Union, but the state never transferred ownership to the church and is now demanding the monks vacate the property. And now when the lease has ended and the monastery has already been rebuilt, they tell us to leave. The abbot also cited pressure from Member of Parliament Igor Hughes, who previously stated his intention to force the monks out. Father Leonti noted that Hughes has recently been involved in the seizure of a cathedral in Volodymyr, which he said was carried out with about 250 armed men, and expressed concern that a similar action could be taken against the monastery. A few days after Hughes made those statements, a commission arrived at the monastery on February 26 to conduct what its head, Vasil Haiduk, described as a survey of the monastery's architectural structures. Blah, blah. Basically, they're about to be evicted once again, another unfortunate monastery church seizure. But that's the end of all the church news that I have. The only other major story I had was, of course, Donald Trump decided to do his first real interview after the beginning of the war with Iran. And who does he choose? Does he go on 60 Minutes? Does he go on Tucker Carlson? Does he go on Bret Baier or one of the more serious Fox News hosts? Does he go even on CNN maybe to shake things up? No. He goes with someone much more estimable, and that is Jake Paul. He goes on to have a discussion with Jake Paul. And he goes on to tell Jake Paul how evil the Iranian regime is for killing gays and oppressing women, and how we're going to free the gays. And Jewish Jake Paul is talking about how awesome that is. So that's what's happening right now. Of course, the Americans are killing little girls in Iran for the Jews and for Israel. Iran is valiantly standing with them. And Donald Trump, the orange man himself, is meeting with Jake Paul. Just a minstrel show, just an absolute clown operation in the United States. So fully standing with Iran. Hail the Ayatollah, hail Ayatollah. Supreme Leader Mojtaba, hail the IRGC, may the missiles strike their targets, and may the American Zionist Jewish occupiers be driven out of the region, inshallah. But that's about all I have for World War Now this week. It's been an intense few weeks of analysis as we enter the third week of the Purim War, of the war with Iran, of the intense, undebated World War III. I like what you said, Dmitry, about how fundamentally I think the earliest stages you could really say World War III began outside of just the entire post-war world order being a Jewish cleanup war to fulfill the Judaization that occurred in World War II. I would say 2008, 2011, you could say the Georgian and the Syrian wars were when you could really say it began at its earliest. And if not that, then I think 2020 with COVID, as Metropolitan Neophytos definitively says. So I think you're right as far as those timelines are concerned. Any final thoughts that you want to leave the audience with this week? Thank you for joining me for this discussion.
Yeah, no, super important. Just a last sort of story actually coming from the northwestern section of Africa, in Nigerian Africa, in a village with a very actually symbolic name. The village's name was Turan. And if you know the word Turan in ancient Iranian, it is the neighboring civilization of Central Asia. So Iran and Turan are like neighboring sort of civilizational groups that are located geographically. And in the village of Turan in northwestern Nigeria, there's been a huge martyrdom of Christians, including the first two Russian Orthodox Christians, members of the Moscow Patriarchate's Exarchate in Africa. They were martyred by Islamists. So there was 10 residents of a Christian village of Turan in northwestern Nigeria that were killed. It's unknown if they were killed by ISIS or Boko Haram, one of those two groups. We know African ISIS was quite active in that region, whereas Boko Haram is more like towards the northeast. And it's sort of just reflective upon the things that are facing Christians in these, especially underdeveloped nations, with these like primitive Islamists that are carrying out their, ideological religious wars against the kuffar. And this well and truly was a martyrdom. Specifically, out of the 10 victims, two young men were members of the Orthodox Church. Their names are actually known, so we can keep them in our prayers as new martyrs of the faith. So we have two new martyrs, Ioan Akule, which is, I guess, St. John now, and Daniel Ahembe. So St. John and St. Daniel, pray for us and pray for all the innocent people in the world and for a further Christianization of Africa. And so we literally have gained two Orthodox Christian saints in the last fortnight, coming out from a very underconsidered region, which Donald J. Trump tried to give some attention, at the end of around Christmas time when he bombed the alleged Islamic villages in Nigeria, if you recall, at the end of 2025. But at this point, there are still places around the world which do suffer from very, I would say, old school anti-Christian persecution. And this is why we need to just keep in mind this sort of Wahhabi Salafi Islamism. It's not Shia Muslim. These are radical Sunni Muslims who are financially and ideologically supported by the same countries which are fighting Iran right now, the Gulf states. And obviously they never attack Israel, but they do attack these innocent, poor, Catholic and Orthodox Christian Nigerians, and giving us new martyrs to this very day. So St. John and St. Daniel, keep us in our prayers. But yeah, it's been a very important episode, I think, Conrad. We need to keep covering this conflict as we have from the very beginning on the podcast and keeping everyone tuned in. So I think we really appreciate the support and feedback. There's been really good activity in the Discord. People have been liking, retweeting the episodes. It's been incredibly active. So the community has been very supportive of, I think, our efforts and the way we've kept everyone in check in terms of the information we've provided. It's been great.
No, it's true. The community's really been great as the war has expanded. That's what I wanted from people. One of the ways you can help, if anybody wants to clipping these episodes, the streams Dmitry and I have done, is one of the most helpful things you can do, because we make so many predictions. We talk about so many things that can later be referenced and vindicated. So please clip things that you find interesting, send them to us, post them in the Discord, send them to us on Telegram, send them to us on Twitter, post them on Substack, wherever you can. One of the best ways that you can help us out. But click all of the relevant links below, like Dmitry was mentioning. Join us on the Discord server. Keep the discussion going. Get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co, obviously, to get access to all of the Ether Hour episodes. Major episodes coming up, talking to journalists from Al Mayadeen in Lebanon, people directly affiliated with the resistance, and Hezbollah and others that we're going to be interviewing about the ground operations as Lebanon prepares to be invaded directly by Israel. They'll be telling us all about the Orthodox situation there and even the Orthodox fighters within Hezbollah. So get behind the paywall to hear all about that. It's going to be some incredible discussions. Also listen to our recent episode, the recent Ether Hour episode we recorded this past week with Gregory Hears, all about Julian the Apostate, first neo-pagan, first Zionist, attempting to rebuild the Jewish temple back in the 4th century. So be sure to check that out. Really, really interesting stuff, very relevant to today. If you want to support the show outside of just getting behind the paywall, or you're already behind the paywall, or you just want to give us a one-time donation, visit our Buy Me a Coffee. If you go to buymeacoffee.com/World War Now, you can donate as little or as much as your heart desires. It really helps us out. And of course, tune into my Tuesday/Wednesday evening live streams. You can ask any questions you want. I'm going through World War news. I'm playing No Guesser, answering audience questions. And of course, you can super chat there and support the show. Again, really, really helpful, and really, really appreciate seeing everybody there. It's a really fun time. You can tune in on YouTube, Substack, or X. So again, really good stuff. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, like this episode. Of course, I forget to say it at the beginning, but if you're not liking all the episodes, you're not really on the team. So on Substack, like the episode. On YouTube, like the episode. On Twitter, like and retweet the episode. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, like the episode, leave a positive review. So share the episodes with the people who you think might find it interesting on whatever platform they think it is the most easy to watch. But ultimately, go back to the Substack, find worldwarnow.co and listen on there, because it's really the best way to tune in. So get the Substack app if you want. It's a really great way to subscribe and support the show. So with all of that, thank you all so much for tuning in and subscribing and supporting everything here. The Purim War, World War III rages on. The prophecies are being fulfilled. So keep us all in your prayers. Some major big updates and big content coming up. And unfortunately, I think as far as material conditions, economically, spiritually, physically in America, we might be in for some natural disasters, major economic decline. So prepare in body and soul. And again, thank you so much for tuning in and allowing us to be your source of news in these fateful latter days. So again, thanks so much for tuning in. worldwarnow.co is where you can find everything. And God bless. We will see you on the next one.